Okay, folks, we are live and on the air. So welcome to the Asheville City Council meeting. If you could just take a moment and mute your cell phones. And if anybody wants to speak on the agenda, you probably already met Jerry out in the hall, and you can go out there and sign up to speak if you haven't done so already, or if at some point during the meeting you decide you want to speak under an item where we're taking public comment, you can also just go out there anytime and sign up to speak. So with that, if everyone would rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We don't have any proclamations on this evening's agenda. We'll move right into the consent agenda. Council, do I have questions, comments, or a motion to adopt the consent agenda?
I just have a comment of gratitude. I know we've been working towards a resolution affirming LGBTQ rights and residents in our community for a while now. I appreciate that specific inclusion for our youth and for live performance, including pride and drag performance, is included. This is not only a matter of art and culture, but also it has an economic impact. And what I'm hearing from our youth is that in the face of such intense legislation, not only in North Carolina, but across the country, now is definitely the time to stand up for our youth. And so I'm glad that we're doing that today.
I'll move.
Okay,
This is
please
Sage.
do, yeah.
Maggie, second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Let me just check and see if we've got anyone
One
signed up.
comment.
We've got, one person signed up to speak under this item. Folks, when you speak tonight, you will have 3 minutes to speak. Just watch the lights on the lectern. Green means go, orange, yellow, whatever it is, it means you're getting close to the end, and red and the buzzer sound means stop. So the person signed up to speak under here is George Swan Tuitt. If I said your last name wrong, you will help me out with that.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I am grateful for the city's affirmation of queer, and specifically trans, existence and difference. Compromise and consensus can be difficult, and so, today, the council should be celebrated. However, because this statement only confirms that the city of Asheville rejects the harm and denial of the trans community and culture, specifically drag performances, there is much more work to be done. It isn't enough because the document fails to address the most frightening issue that motivated it, namely, the mental state and physical dangers posed to the trans youth and teens in our time. It fails to offer a positive vision for enabling the wholeness for trans teens in Asheville. Recognition without action does not allow you to say that you aided the trans youth of Asheville. Enabling wholeness and doing right by trans teens in Asheville need not be difficult. Doing good can begin with very small steps, and I would like to briefly recommend an easy step forward. The City Council could vote to create a committee charged with creating inclusive spaces within Asheville schools, and this committee could include the very people at risk, namely trans youth, as well as people that can impact our lives positively. Are there any questions?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Now we have someone else signed up to speak under consent, and that is Jonathan Wainscott.
Just ran up here, I'm a little out of breath. Jonathan Wainscott, I think I was going to talk about the LGBTQIA affirmation, the consent agenda. And I just wanted to, real quick, this weekend, I wanted to give props to Austin Killips. I don't know if you're familiar with Austin Killips. She's a trans woman who just won the Belgian waffle ride, the bicycle race down in Hendersonville, and came in first place in the women's division. So good for her. I'm sorry for the second place winner who didn't get that. She won by 4 minutes, and then If she had competed in the male division, she would have lost by an hour. But I just want to thank all of these members of council for providing more places in this world for people like me, people with a penis, to compete and dominate, because that's what's happening, and the patriarchy thanks you for that. I think that it's, there are a lot of people who are worried about women getting hurt in sports by the inclusion of trans athletes, and I'm not concerned about that too much. I did see the, what was her name? Peyton McNabb. She has like an NFL name, and she also has an NFL-style concussion. She's the woman who got hit in the face with a volleyball by a trans athlete, and everybody's like watching this video of this trans woman just skying and putting this ball right in her face. It comes bouncing off of her face so fast it doesn't even lose any speed, hits the net. None of her teammates picked it up. They got the point, and this poor woman was laid out on the floor for a minute, and now she doesn't have feeling in her face because she got so hit hard, got hit so hard that she's probably suffered permanent damage. But I don't care about that because you don't care about that. And so if 7 sports-loving women aren't concerned about this issue, I'm not going to be concerned about it either. I would like to let you know that unfortunately it's 2023 and there are no tampons in the men's room, so I would like to maybe get that into the budget next year. I'm looking forward to having more places to go in this world. I appreciate that. And for the people who are concerned about gender affirmation therapy, this also applies to, like, you could have a boy who doesn't see his masculinity in his body the way he does in his mind, and we can give them puberty advancers, and so a 10-year-old can become a grown man at that age, so they compete a little bit better and get that edge. So you're really doing a lot for people like me in this, and I really appreciate all that you're doing, because my sons now have options that they didn't have. They can, if they're not good in male sports, they can either ramp up and take drugs to bring them into the fold and be real men. Like Jose Canseco wasn't cheating. He was just taking
Thank you. Thank you. We don't have anyone else signed up under consent. We have a motion and a second. Any other questions, comments
I
from
forgot
council?
one of my comments was just that, and thank you for the reminder, that resolutions are value statements, they are not the work, but we have a lot of work to do in our community to make it safe and welcoming place for all the people who live, work, and visit here.
All right, council, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. Switching gears, we're going to the manager's report, and under this section, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah Campbell, our manager.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I only have one item under the manager's report, and it's one that gives me a lot of joy. I always like to recognize city employees when they particularly meet some professional milestones. And so tonight, we have the opportunity to recognize one of our quiet but highly effective City of Asheville employees. So City of Asheville employees are heroes in many ways. We want to acknowledge their exemplary work all of the time, but especially when employees accomplish something extraordinary. Next slide, Madam Clerk. Madam Clerk. So this evening, we recognize Sarah Gross for obtaining her Master Municipal Clerk designation from the International Institute of Municipal Clerks. We are... Now, let's see.
The one cheering the loudest is Maggie.
So I want to provide just a little bit of background about our dedicated and overachiever public servant. In July of 2018, Deputy City Clerk Sarah Gross obtained her North Carolina Certified Municipal Clerk designation. In 2019, Sarah obtained her master's degree in public administration. And on May 9th, 2023, Sarah obtained the highest designation from the International Institute of Municipal Clerks, Master Municipal Clerk. Next slide, please. Sarah served as deputy clerk since 2016, and in her role, she has shown exemplary dedication not only in her role as deputy clerk, but also as the manager of our boards and commissions. Not an easy task. Sarah's outstanding service to the city has been recognized by the School of Government, as they have asked her to participate in panel discussions, along with using her board and commission manuals in their coursework. Next slide, please. Even before she was bestowed this distinguished honor, we knew she was a master public servant. Thank you, Sarah, for your dedication to the city of Asheville and the public that we serve. Thank you so much.
First of all,
Speech,
thank you.
speech.
It's a lot that I'm saying anything. But I do, it means a lot to me. But also, Mickey is the first master municipal clerk and also my mentor. So I'm very thankful for all of y'all.
Well, thank you so much for all your hard work, and we have a plan for the future for if Maggie ever decides to retire. And I also want to say, Sarah, you are much loved, and we have our former vice mayor here, Gwen Whistler, who came to help honor this evening, and I know brought you flowers. I saw.
Yay!
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. That concludes my presentation.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of council. Jay Dundas, Capital Projects Director, serving in the role tonight as Administrative Liaison to the Independent Review Committee. Just would like to provide an introduction to the group. They're in the second and third rows here of the council chambers tonight. Recognize their hard work, and I won't take up any more time, and I'll have Keith Webb with McGill Associates kick us off.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and Council. We're glad to be here to present the report from the Independent Review Committee of the water outage that occurred at Christmas. As Jade mentioned, I'm an engineer with McGill Associates here in town, one of the vice presidents. And it's my pleasure to present this report to you all tonight and the subcommittee. The subcommittee members have given freely of their time and have conducted a number of reviews and analysis of the water outage in a very professional manner. The committee recognizes the importance of the Asheville water system, not only to the city of Asheville, but to Buncombe County, to the towns of Black Mountain, Biltmore Forest, Weaverville, Woodfin Water, and northern Henderson County. Without the water system, the life we have in Asheville would not be available. It protects the public health and it spurs economic growth. So our committee took it very on their shoulders to come up with the answers that you all look for. As directed, the resolution established the RRC to complete an analysis of the system, not only looking at the operation of the water system, but the ability to communicate to the public when good and bad things happen, and emergency response. Our task force was put together, had a very short time frame. We met that time frame, we think, by presenting the report to the manager last week, and our understanding is that that final report was published on the city's website on Friday for everybody to review. As directed by the resolution, the committee was composed of 9 members. And those members.
Yeah. Help with the, I think you just need to press there.
Those 9 members appointed by 7 by the city and 2 by the county were Rob Brisley, who's part of the communications group, Dennis Fagnet, who's the fire chief at West Buncombe and part of the emergency response, Michael Holcomb, who's one of the 3 subject area experts that were retained, Mike McGill did communications, an expert there, John McLaughlin is one of the subject area experts in public water, Kim Durton Murphy is one of the water customers for the city, so has a special interest. Carolyn Roy is a industry, commercial customer of the city, so has a very interest in it. And Ted Tyree is one of the subject experts, and he works with Knoxville Utility Board. So, quick summary, we started our committee work on February 20th. As I said, short time frame. At that meeting, it was decided to expedite the work that we had to do to divide the committee into 3 subcommittees, a water system and operations committee, a communications committee, and an emergency response. Each of those committees selected a chair or co-chair that would work together, and any of the 9 members could serve on any of the committees they desired to do that. I'll point out that Dirk decided she wanted to commit on all of them, and we congratulate her on doing that. It certainly took some time. So the report that you're going to hear tonight from the 3 subcommittee chairs summarizes 3 months of hard work, numerous interviews with not only staff, but elected officials, water customers, anybody we could think to interview to see what went wrong, how we could correct that, to reduce the vulnerability in the future. There was more than 90 requests for information requested to city staff and others, and the committee wants to thank all of those that we responded to for timely review and getting that information back, which made the committee's work easier. I'd be remiss not to recognize 2 people. One of them is Kelly O'Brien, who was appointed and hired by the city to help facilitate this, this committee and be the kindergarten cop, I'll call her, to keep us all on task, and she did a great job. But most important, I want to recognize the efforts of Jay Dundas, who took all of these 90 requests. The requests came from every angle, and Jade was there getting timely responses and keeping us on track. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ted Tyree, who is one of the subcommittee members and the chair of the water system operations. Ted will then be followed by Mike McGill of comms and Dennis on the emergency response.
Thank you, Keith. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the other members of our subcommittee. These folks went above and beyond and were extremely active, so I thank them as well. Since I'm going first, I'll do a couple of intro slides just to set the context for my presentation as well as the 2 that follow me. Just to remind you about what you asked us to do. You asked us to review the outage and provide a comprehensive account of the event. You asked us to assess the city's operational response. And then, perhaps most importantly, you asked us to make recommendations that will maximize prevention of future events. I think we've done that. Real quickly, an overview of your system. It's not a small system. It's 60,000 connections. Has 3 very impressive treatment plants. Not only did we talk to staff, as Keith mentioned, we also toured your facilities. And then we spent a fair amount of time following up with staff. Some we talked to 3 or 4 times. The 3 treatment plants have a total capacity of more than 43 million gallons per day. It's over 1,700 miles of pipe, 20,000 valves, and you average about 21.5 million gallons a day. I will talk about demand, but demand is how much water is being called for at any given time or in 24-hour slices, midnight to midnight. I threw the illustration up here, and it's a very simplified version of your system layout, because I wanted to point out the two treatment plants, the William Burrell plant and the North Fork plant, are located up in the northeast sector. And then the newest plant, the Mills River plant, is in the south portion and supplies water into the south part of the system, pulling from the French Broad. That will become important, the relative location of those facilities, as the event played out. So what happened? And this is a very brief synopsis. The report itself contains a much more detailed description of what happened. Cold weather moved into your area on December 23rd of 2022. The temperatures were not unprecedented, but was unprecedented was the resulting demand on your water system. The highest 24-hour periods during the event got as high as 31 to 32 million gallons per day. That result was the result of a total of 27 main breaks that occurred during the outage, but it was also accompanied by record high customer consumption, on-property consumption. We are fairly certain that was because homeowners let their faucets drip or run to try to prevent them from freezing. They did the same thing in Knoxville. And while that worked for a lot of people, for some it didn't. So they had frozen pipes, which resulted in broken pipes and leakage on property. So a lot of demand coming from not only breaks on your system, but leaks and breaks and consumption on property. The Mills River treatment plant, that's the one in the south, was taken offline on Saturday morning, the 24th. Because of cold-induced treatability issues, they had to take it offline. And it wound up being offline for about 4 days. It came back on Wednesday, the 28th. That still left you the two plants up in the northeast sector. And that's a combined supply capacity of 36 MGD coming from those two plants. Now, what I didn't mention earlier is those two plants up in the northeast sector, they're up high elevation in the mountains, and they supply their water into your system by gravity. So however much is called for, it flows into the system by gravity. That's very unique. What that means is if that's the only plants that are supplying your system, then that water has to flow freely all the way to the western portion of the system and to the southern portion of the system if you don't have Mills River online. That's important. Once Mills River went offline, it didn't take long for some customers to start having low pressure or no water in the south and the west. Thousands of customers were affected. We still don't know exactly how many. And the city staff made the decision on Monday evening to isolate most of the south portion of the system. They deployed pumps near Candler Knob Tank, that's in the far western portion of the system, to try to replenish those tanks, but they simply weren't able to supply enough water to the pumps for that to be successful. Eventually, the tanks got to the point where they needed to valve them out of service. Even after Mills River came back online on Wednesday morning, the 28th, the system recovery was slow, and then on January the 2nd, that's the following Monday, they found a closed 24-inch valve in the River Arch District, and when they immediately opened that, and when it was opened, the tanks began to fill more quickly. As you know, the final boil water advisory was lifted on Wednesday the 4th, and then within a week of that, you just opted to create the committee that we served on January the 10th. So what did we do? Keith mentioned we interviewed staff multiple times. We toured your facilities. We did a tremendous amount of data analysis. Your system, City of Asheville Water Department, has one of the best SCADA systems that I have seen. SCADA is an acronym that stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. It's a fancy term, but here's what it means. It allows the system operators to control certain equipment remotely, and most all medium and large utilities will have a SCADA system. Yours is very good. It also allows instrumentation that's out in the system that's measuring flow and pressure, tank levels, valve positions, to be sending that data back to a server continuously. Now, the thing that's most helpful that it does for us is every 1 minute, it writes that data to a data historian or a database. And once we learned that you had this data every minute, we requested everything you had from December 1st to January 31st, because we wanted to see what normal looked like before the event, and then during the event, and then what it looked like as you returned to normal. Tremendous amount of data. We could basically recreate the event with data. I put a graph on this slide. I know you probably can't read it, but that's not the point. I wanted you to see what we do as part of our analysis, doing cause and effect analysis. It allows us to line everything up on the same time plane. So, for example, when Mills River went offline, we can see what the tanks do. And not surprisingly, they plummeted. The other thing that we saw during our analysis, which surprised me even more, is typically once you get past a peak demand period, primarily in the evening, and everybody's asleep, water demands go down, and your system refills. So your tanks go from being at their low point to being at their high point. And you want to get them refilled before you hit the next demand period next morning. Once the event started, you basically did not refill your tanks hardly at all. That's very unusual and very surprising. Now, what makes that even more surprising for us as a committee was you still had surplus capacity. You had 36 MGD of capacity, and your demands were 24-hour demands, never exceeded 32. So the question we ask ourselves is, why could the system not supply enough water? And we needed to understand that. We would go back to staff and we asked more questions. And we came up with what we suspected was going on. We wanted to do some computer modeling. Hazen Engineering is the company that does the city's modeling. They're very good at it. So we asked the city, can we utilize Hazen to do some scenarios? What if? And it's all computer-based, so you just set up the scenarios and then let it run. So they simulated the high demands, they simulated closed valves, open valves, and we had 2 meetings with them. There's 2 sets of results. We included both executive summaries in our report. So that's kind of what we did. Let me jump into our findings. As I've implied, the underlying cause our committee decided was the inability to supply enough water to meet demand. That was the underlying problem. You just couldn't supply enough water into the system. The closed 24-inch valve that was found in the River Arts District, which is on a major line that connects northeast to far west, was a significant restriction. That was a problem. Furthermore, we learned that the city had already suspected that they had a problem that was affecting the tanks in the far western portion, the Candler Knob tanks. This dates back to the summer of 2019. And sometime between then and January of 2022, they worked with Hazen to do some modeling, which is typically what you do when you don't understand why is this happening in our system. It's not behaving as you might expect to. So Hazen came back and did a presentation on January the 10th of 2022 that identified the high probability of some type of anomaly, probably a throttled or closed valve in the River Arts District. We asked staff about that. They said, yes, we did get the presentation. We looked for a closed valve and we simply couldn't find one. Now, we do think that's the valve that was found on January the 2nd at 6:45 p.m. and it was opened. Now, in Hazen's modeling work, they also identified another 24-inch valve, we'll call it the south control valve, that was what we call in the industry throttled. It wasn't completely closed, but it was never opened more than 10%. And that is on a major line that feeds the southern portion of the system. Now, the reason it was only open 10%, and sometimes utilities will do this, it is controlled by SCADA, or it can be controlled by their SCADA system remotely. So if an operator would go in and tell that valve, I want you to open to 100%, it had been configured in the SCADA system to only open to 10%. And the reason they did that was because if you open it all the way, you run the risk of overflowing a downstream tank. So based on their experience, they had said, we don't want that valve to open more than 10% remotely. If we ever need for it to be opened all the way, you can send a technician to the site and manually open it all the way. But during this event, it was open, or during the critical part of the event, it was only open to 10%. Now, what Hazen's modeling had indicated is that was another significant restriction to try to get water south. The other thing that we had many conversations about was what we refer to as the East Asheville Booster Pump Station. And this grew out of conversations about your system needing to be more resilient. Resilient is a term, it's kind of a buzzword in the water industry for the last 5+ years, 10 years. And it's kind of a belt and suspenders mentality. You never want one or two things to bring your system down. You've got to have resiliency in terms of having different tools that you can bring online or do to try and address that. It becomes extremely critical during high demand events. The East Asheville Booster Pump Station was last used in, we think, 08 or 09. Sometime after 2010, it was decommissioned. Let me be clear, during the Christmas event, it was not available for use. It's basically been disconnected from the system. But since we were doing what-if analysis with Hazen, we asked them to include some scenarios where the pumps at the pump station would come online, and they did that. We did that because we were curious if that would help restore downstream hydraulic grade, and they came back and said, yes, it would raise system pressures significantly, or it would improve system pressures. We include their quote in the report. So we talked a lot about the East Asheville Booster Pump Station, but you wouldn't have been able to use it during the event. I don't want you to lead you to think that it was available for use, because it was not. We were primarily looking ahead for the future. There were other factors that we identified indirectly contributed to the event, its scope and duration. I'm not going to go through those individually. I'll just jump straight into the recommendations, which is where I'll speak about them. Bottom line, though, before we leave our findings, our committee reached consensus that the magnitude and duration of the event was largely avoidable and preventable. So we've cast our recommendations as both immediate and then short and long term. There's just two immediate ones. Conduct an independent valve assessment of all large transmission mains. When we say large, typically we mean 16-inch and larger. Now you have close to 20,000 valves, but you only have a few hundred of the large diameter transmission valves. There are companies out there that specialize in doing this, so you can contract this out. It's not prohibitively expensive. It doesn't take them too awful long to do it. You just need to get them under contract if that's what you decide to do, and get on their schedule. It's critical that transmission valves are open or in the position that they're supposed to be in. The second one, and this is an easy one, that south control valve that I spoke about only being at 10%, we're recommending that that be changed within your SCADA system so they can remotely open it to 100%. That way you don't have to depend on someone to remember that it's only 10%, and then you don't have to send somebody there to manually open it. Now they will, if they do this, they will have to build in some safeguard that they don't overflow that downstream tank, which is what they were trying to avoid, and that's a realistic issue. So those were the two immediate recommendations. Short-term and long-term, these are a little more, they can be a little more complicated, or they might have a budgetary component, which the city will have to figure out what they're going to do in terms of capital improvements, or they're just not urgent. That's where we landed with the East Asheville Booster Pump Station. We stopped short of saying you need to refurbish that thing and get it back online. What we decided to recommend was hire a consulting firm to help you do pump testing, electrical assessment of the equipment and the controls, and then produce what we call a preliminary engineering report. PER is very common in the utility industry. That consultant will help lay out some options, cost those out for you, and then you can decide what you want to do with that. It will require some funding if you go that route, so it might require some tweaks to your capital improvement plan. Number 4, within your SCADA historian, and this one's easy to do, derive each 24-hour period what your total daily demand is for that. I think your staff already knows how much water they put into the system, but if you utilize the data that you have to derive total daily demand, then each 24-hour period, usually when your midnight report prints, you can compare what was our demand and what did we supply. Those numbers should always be fairly close. You never want to get too far behind the 8 ball, especially during a high demand event, because it's very difficult to catch back up. Oops, I'm sorry. Number 5, we applaud the fact that the City of Asheville Water Department is moving toward AMI, smart meters. That stands for Advanced Metering Infrastructure. I think you approved that funding last July, perhaps. But when the event hit in December, they're just not very far along down that path. So you didn't have many of those converted over to smart meters, and you weren't able to derive the benefit that it brings. If there's any way you can expedite that, we would recommend that staff take a look at doing that. It opens up a whole new world in terms of information flow. You know who has water, who doesn't. And it gives you a tremendous amount of timely information that you didn't have during the event. Number 6, we've talked to Director Melton about this. We recommend you reevaluate the role of the department's engineering division. Frankly, we were a little surprised. It's fairly small. There's not many engineers, and the ones we talked to aren't directly, as far as we could tell, aren't directly involved in day-to-day operational decisions or in-depth hydraulics discussions. The reason that stood out to me and to our committee is your system is not simple. It is complex from a hydraulic standpoint. It is a mountainous area. It's all about elevations. Some areas have low pressure. Some areas down low have really high pressure. And you have to manage that. And it is a challenge. I thought Knoxville's was challenging, but ours can't hold a candle to yours in terms of complexity. So that's what civil engineers who are trained in hydraulics, that's what they do. So we think that role needs to be reevaluated, and probably the staff grown. It's hard to hire people like that and bring them from the private sector into the public sector. But you hire them young and groom them and grow them. And I would recommend you have 2, because one of them is prone to leave and go. So that's the reality. Number 7, conduct a knowledge retention assessment within the department and identify any gaps. Knowledge retention is another buzzword in the water industry. We've had a lot of people retire, and other folks have left the public sector and gone to work in the private sector. When that happens and you don't manage it well, you can have a tremendous amount of loss of institutional knowledge. So every utility faces that. You're not alone. The Water Research Foundation is a tremendous resource. They've done a lot of research on this, and it's funded by member utilities. There's case studies out there. There are research reports that you can see what other utilities, what other municipalities have done to try to manage that. Everybody has faced that. Fortunately, we had what I would consider to be a subject matter expert on tabletop exercises. Your water department has started down that path of doing some tabletop exercises. We're recommending that they ramp that up. Try to do at least 2 a year. Some of them would be internal to the department. Some would be in collaboration with external agencies. Those are critically important that you do those, because that's when you want to put people in situations where you push them out of their comfort zone. Make them uncomfortable, because they have to make tough calls. And I would include all of you in this. It's just, that's when you want to practice it. You don't want to practice it during the actual event. Number 9, we applaud what y'all are doing, what your water department's doing with district and zone meters. Those are meters that are out in the system at key locations measuring flow and pressure and sending that data back. You don't have many of them, and it's going to take more funding to accelerate that. But we've talked to your staff. They would like to have more of those because they know what they provide for them. But you just have a handful right now. They would have been helpful during the event putting the pieces together. And then lastly, we think you should consider the creation of a water utility advisory board. These have been effective in other cities, municipalities. The key word there is advisory. It is not an oversight authority. They have no operational control. There's simply people from the community that can stay in touch with the water department leadership and be a resource for them, ask questions, make sure that the voices from the community are being heard, but they're also a resource for all of you. I think they can be a tremendous help. Some municipalities have done it. I think we've named a few in the report. It needs to be done well, though. Don't ever lose the word advisories there. That's the key thing. They're not there to govern. So with that, I thank you for your time. I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Mike McGill, who will present the communications perspective.
Thank you.
Ted is a tough act to follow, so, but I appreciate that. I served on the committee, and they did a lot of excellent work, and they answered a lot of tough questions along the way. The communications team was myself. My firm, Water PIO, does this for a living. I led the after-action review for Austin, Texas, after the Texas freeze, where they had a bore water advisory for 1 million people because they lost water in their system. Rob Risley was on board to be the expert on emergency communications response planning, implementation, national incident management system, incident command system. And Dirt was phenomenal because Rob and I are not from here. So Dirt was on the committee providing a lot of information from the community to inform our work. And it was extremely valuable. Jade, obviously, can't thank him enough. Really made this process easy. A lot of tough questions answered quickly, so I can't thank him enough. Our process, in part thanks to Jade, we covered a lot of ground. We did more than 50 hours of interviews with members of the community, city staff, elected officials like yourselves, the news media, and I'd like to thank the news media as well. They were put in an interesting spot. I had to interview them for the committee work while they were covering our committee. So we came up with some guidelines and process to work with, and they worked with that process. So they really helped inform this work. So I'm very appreciative to them for what they did, because it was a unique situation. Community leaders, business leaders, impacted customers. I had a great conversation with my Uber driver coming in to the city about what happened. So we listened to everybody who wanted to talk to us. We had document review, we reviewed the comms and the emergency response plans as well. So what we want to start off with, and this is important for communications, I've been doing crisis comms work for 20 years now, is it's easy here in June to talk about what happened back then and kind of think, oh gee, it's, everything's perfect. At the time, it's important to discuss what everybody was dealing with, what everybody was facing, because it helped lead to the communications response that we saw. So I don't have to tell you how this happened smack dab in the middle of the holiday. Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and the day afterwards, which was a holiday for the city. So you had this impact right in the middle of that. And so there was a belief in our interviews, and like I said, we did a lot of interviews to come to these conclusions. We found that there was a kind of a hope, a belief that if the water main breaks that they found might have been impacting the system, if they were repaired, then this situation would not elevate to something of a serious nature like we saw. And that belief informed the communications. You had Mills River going down, which for any other system might have been one that kind of sprung to an emergency level, except for the fact that you had operated for months without Mills River before. So that past situation informed what happened during this situation. So it's unfair to kind of treat this as if it happened in the middle of a typical work week. So like I said, that hope led to the way the communications developed, what I call an operational approach to communications. And I've presented on this for the American Water Works Association at their conferences before, because it is an approach that we see all over the country with water utilities. The idea is, if you focus on responding to the crisis, the physical response to the crisis, then you don't need to potentially panic the public. And in this case, panic the public during Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and the day after Christmas. So the goal is you solve the problem with your system, and hopefully, and you have kind of managed communications that don't necessarily elevate to everybody we've got an emergency, with the hope that if you resolve the system problems, you don't have to put out those communications later. The problem with that is, as I'll get in more detail, is if the repair doesn't go well, then you're already behind the game on communications, and that's what we saw here. We also found that communication staff, they were on call during this event. They asked the right questions, but they did not have the training, and we'll go into this further, or the information about the water system where they could ask informed questions. You know, they had the basics covered of who, what, when, where, and how, but they really didn't have information where they could direct perhaps the water team to making some other informed communications decisions. So our key finding, like I said, that operational approach. You prioritize finding and fixing problems, your communications stay safe, and the idea is if you find and fix the problem, then the communications don't have to elevate. Like I said, in this situation, because the repairs weren't made, because they couldn't fix the system, that approach to communications put them in trouble from the start. So when this elevated, they had to play catch up. And that's the last thing you want to do with crisis communications. The approach also kept the water team in charge. And as will probably be discussed in Dennis's approach, you know, this didn't elevate to a citywide, system-wide, everybody all in emergency. It was managed basically by the water department and the city staff here. And because of that, the water team was in charge. So, like I said, their fallback was to work on the operational approach to communications. We discovered during the process that they had actually declared a major emergency on Christmas Day when it came to the demand that they were seeing in the system. But the communications that day were of, you know, we have an issue with our system, but we need you to voluntarily conserve your water. So it didn't quite match up. And that was reflective of, like I said, that operational approach. What we always say, and it's kind of a best practice, is if you lose your water plant, you are changing the composition of your water for your customers. So that automatically elevates to an emergency notification to all. Because, again, they had operated for months without Mills River, it wasn't as much of a concern for them. However, as we've talked with the water team before, even a minor change in the composition of the water is one that you need to inform your customers about. You know, that is a public health safety concern. And it's not a Department of Homeland Security issue at all to say a water plant has gone down. This is what we dealt with in Austin, Texas. Their big water plant went down. And the emergency communications after consultation with DHS was, you've got to tell people that this water plant went down. So there was also a little bit of a confusing communication because Mills River wasn't named. It was kind of given as a directional location for the water plant. That was overuse of DHS and it led to confusion, but that's an easy fix. What we also found was there was a lack of a proper crisis communications plan, structure, and process. You know, like I said before, being a crisis communicator, I use National Incident Management System, Incident Command System for crisis communications, and it works well. There's a reason why that structure's there, and there's a reason why it works all over the country on just about every emergency that you can imagine. It defines your communications process. And even if you don't fully implement the system, you can still pull the communications piece out of NIMS and use it on just about any situation. And unfortunately, that wasn't used here. If it was used here, if you did have that structure, there's someone called the Public Information Officer. They report to only one person, the incident commander. That's it. They decide, they're in on every meeting, they help inform the communications, and they work with the incident commander to get those communications together and out. It's a very one-to-one process. And it's designed so that if you get, you know, with every crisis, you kind of get punched in that first 48 hours. But after that, the goal is you get on a regular, consistent stream of communications. And that's what the process does under NIMS and Incident Command. And that you didn't have that here. And because of that, you had a process where there was a lot of people, a lot of cooks in the kitchen, if you will, that should not have been there under a successful process. You never got into that rhythm. The rhythm in communications kind of follows the news day. So if I'm on a crisis, I'm informing the public before the morning newscasts, in the middle of the morning when decisions are basically made for the rest of the day. That informs the noon newscast. Then you've got early to mid-afternoon before the evening newscast. And then you got another update that comes in the middle of the evening to set up the 11 o'clock news. And then you just rinse, lather, repeat throughout the entire process. That's what you need to do in order to have successful crisis comms. The lack of the established process led to subject matter and comm staff recommendations being overridden by politicians. That's what happened here. They were not in charge of the process. They did not have final say in communications. They were producers. They were pushing it out. And that is not a successful process to use. We found there's a lot of distrust of the news media. They were not brought in early and often during this process. They were left kind of out at a distance. Yes, there were press conferences held, but that's not really how you inform the public during a crisis. They're helpful maybe once a day to give an overall view, an overall approach on what you're going to have that entire day and what you're going to work on, but they are not the number one path to get out communications. Like I said, it's that regular stream all throughout the day. So you don't have information gaps that confuse, that are created that can confuse the public, where social media jumps in with false information. And so if you have that relationship with the press and you're working with them constantly, you get into that flow and you're informing the public properly throughout the crisis. But here, what I heard from the press during my interviews was there was a reliance on the press conference approach, and all their questions weren't answered. So they said, well, we get follow-up, and the follow-up wasn't as successful. And then those questions went unanswered in some cases. You can't really have that in a crisis. The water team, this is where Asheville alerts come in. I was looking at it from afar, and there was control over the Asheville alert system. Normal process, the water team is the one pushing out alerts through Asheville, through your alert system, which is a perfectly fine process during a regular situation. You have a break, you have customers impacted, you put out some communications. But at a crisis level, they should not have been the ones putting out those communications. And Asheville Alert should not have been used as a primary communication vehicle like it was here. I built a crisis communication system for utilities serving 2 million people back in 2008. It's top of the line. You don't use it as a primary communications tool. It's secondary. It's helpful. People have to sign up for it. And the people who tend to sign up for it are ones that are more astute, if you will, when it comes to communications technology. So you're kind of setting up information where it goes to kind of have and have-nots. You don't want that in a crisis. So Asheville Alerts, which was a primary information stream here, should have been a secondary one. Then, and I understand this was common throughout the entire interview process. There was frustration over the fact that you could not give the public an accurate measure of who was without service. And I understand that. But your infrastructure doesn't really allow you to give that information. So the number was given, and this was kind of a group decision. There was not one actor here over another, where a decision was made to say that about 38,000 people were without service. The thing is, that number was based not in reality of who was without service, but how many people were signed up for Asheville Alerts. So that number was plugged in. It shouldn't have been done. But I will say, before, kind of light them on fire for it, that number was high. So in other words, you kind of over-informed and overestimated the people who were without water. It still shouldn't have been done. However, it was not a public health concern because I believe you overestimated the outage. We had questions about the city manager and her involvement in the process. Those came from the media as well as people we interviewed. What we found and what Rob found, especially working through it, is that contrary to coverage, the city manager performed exactly as she should during this process. The city manager is not a spokesperson during a crisis. They are a facilitator to make sure the response is going well within the city, with staff, whatever they need, that's what the city manager does. But they are not a public face of the response to a crisis. So that was a misconception that we wanted to clean up. One area where the city manager was very honest and said she wished she had done better was management of the process, kind of keeping the communications to water and comms team versus allowing members of the this council to come in and inform the information that was going out to the public. Because like I mentioned before, in a proper crisis communications process, that doesn't happen. Lack of crisis comms and trainings, water systems training, kept comms staff from fully serving in comms role. This is being addressed. This is, I got a crash course in my first job in water in 2007. My utility went through 2,100 water main breaks my first winter. I got a crash course. That is the type of training and information you need to give to your comm staff. They were largely reduced to producers, not decision makers on comms, because of their lack of knowledge of the system and their lack of crisis communications training. Without NIMS and the incident command system in place, you didn't have quality control. You didn't have final approval processes where they were in charge. So they were left to basically provide input, but their decisions were not final. And you need that in this situation. In this situation, there was a lot of confusion and information gaps created with who was informed on cancel, when, and how. It wasn't even-handed. It wasn't a process that was set. So all of you were equally informed about what was going on. That created a situation where there was political involvement in the comms decision and the messaging. This is not a best practice, especially in crises. You answer your questions. It is perfectly right and reasonable for you to express frustration and to ask questions about the information that is being developed and being put out. However, direct involvement in the communications, including final decisions, is not a best practice. All hands, the all hands on deck approach led to harmful delays. Communications that should have gone out in 15 minutes or half an hour took hours to be put together and be put out. And they kind of were kitchen sink documents. This was a complaint we got from the press, that there was everything in the world in some of the communications that were going out. There wasn't really a focus on what is the key information you've got to get out in this crisis to the public. And when you have all the facts thrown in, it's very hard to pull out the key ones. As Ted talked about, infrastructure limitations also impacted the comms here, because your communications and water team couldn't really get a handle on just how many people were without service. That did impact the communications. I understand the frustration of council. Hey, why can't we just give a good solid estimate of who is without water and where? Unfortunately, with your system, as I discovered in my interviews, I talked to two people. One was without water for 5 days. One wasn't without water at all, and they were basically next door neighbors. I mean, that is the difficulty of the system here. So that is why the communications are so important to cover that ground. We found this in Austin, Texas as well. There's the desire to have an outage map for water akin to what you see with electric companies, like Duke Energy. I can go to a map, I can see who's without power, I can get a restoration estimate. You can't do that in water. It's very difficult. Austin, Texas had one of the best systems in the world, and they couldn't do it. And they tried to put together an outage map in the middle of the crisis, just like you did. And it had the same effect. Yes, you tried, and it's good that you tried. However, it can cause more problems than it helps if you do it in the middle of the situation. So the lesson is learned for next time. Perhaps you can develop a map using what you have at your disposal now without being under pressure, without being under the gun. But Austin, Texas had that. They have one of the best AMI systems in the world, and they had the same situation that you had. The radio read meters just can't give you that information. The second main focus of the report, this was the one that kind of angered me as a communicator before I even came on board. It was a communication that service was going to be restored on December 27th within 24 to 48 hours. And the reason why I was upset about it, and I talked to my committee members about it, is because that's just not a communication that goes out from a crisis communicator on water and on a communications team. You just don't do it. In this case, what we discovered was that communications was put out, even though it was highly unlikely to maybe the nth degree that you were not going to meet that window of time. Tanks had not started refilling yet. The reason why this is elevated in importance is because I use this example with just about everybody I interviewed. This is message that impacts public decisions on what they do during the crisis, how they protect their own health. If I'm told I'm going to get my service back within a day or two, I made some decisions where I was like, okay, maybe I can get through this. Maybe I can just find some water, sit tight, I'll be okay. If I'm told that it could last 4, 5, 6 days, it's a very different decision to make. Especially in my case, I use this example, my mother's 84. I'm making a very different decision if I only have to get her water for a day or two versus if I have to get it for 4, 5, or 6. So that was the situation and why it was elevated importance. I understand the frustration that was expressed about the inability of the water and comms team to put out the information that the public really wanted the most. Who was without water when, or who was without water where and when they were going to get it back. I understand that frustration. However, you can't provide information that does not have the likelihood of being successful. You just can't do it. You can't put it out there with a caveat and say, okay, I guess the goal will be 24 to 48 hours. Public doesn't hear that in a crisis. They only latch on to 24 to 48. And because of that, people made different decisions about how to handle their own personal health. What we found in multiple interviews with multiple staff, multiple departments, including the mayor, confirmed that the mayor put direct pressure on the water and comm staff to release a restoration timeframe. Water and comm staff did not feel that communications should go out, but they felt extreme pressure to come up with those communications and put them out. Multiple people said it was job-threatening levels of pressure brought about by the mayor. That led to David Melton saying, and we had this from 3 different people, direct quote, I guess we can say we have a goal of 24 to 48 hours. And that became the public message. The idea to give a time frame, but to put in caveats that maybe give you some wiggle room. Problem is, in a crisis, people are going to latch on to 24 to 48 hours. They're going to make their decisions on 24 to 48 hours. That's what the press reported, was 24 to 48 hours. So that set expectations with the public that you could not meet. And when you miss those expectations, that's basically why our report ends there. Because once you miss that window of restoration, public wasn't listening to you anymore. Staff put out a lot of great communications to the public about what to do, what the updates were, what was going on. But what we heard time and time again from members of the public, we weren't listening anymore. We didn't trust the response anymore. We weren't going to believe anything you said. If you came back to us and said again, we're going to get it back in 24 to 48 hours, well, you missed that the first time around. Why should we believe it the second time around? So that was a major hindrance to crisis comms following that approach. So our recommendations, first off, get rid of that operational approach to communications. Like I said, this is not a unique situation. This is throughout the entire water industry. I've been dealing with this for years. It's the way they've operated for decades. Solve the physical problem first, and maybe you don't have to scare the public with communications about losing their water for days on end. And unfortunately, when you have that situation like you have here, it can go sideways quickly. We already know that a public information officer dedicated to the Water Resources Department is already in motion. It's already been approved, I believe. Crisis comms training for all CAPE staff based on incident command training programs to provide redundancy and shift flexibility. So during a crisis, you'll have your public information officer, but you have to have people that also are in shift, what we call shifts A, B, C, to get through the crisis. You have to have people that can step in. The institutional communications program, a portion of the incident command system under NIMS, even if you don't fully implement a crisis response, like Dennis will go into, you can still pull out the communications work and operate from there. Using the I just said that. Make sure you have a structure where the public information officer is only responsive to the incident commander. The incident commander takes everything together and takes all that information and works with the public information officer, and that's it. So you have faster communications, fully approved by incident command, without 5, 6 people getting mixed into the process. Oh, one of my recommendations disappeared. Actually, no, it was just reformatting, I guess. We recommend media training for all comms-related staff and department leaders You know, we know that in the middle of a crisis is not exactly a time for you to try and learn information, not a time for you to learn how to work with the press. So you do them training in advance, kind of blue skies. That's what we talk about in crisis comms. When there are blue skies, that's when you do the training and the work. Rob took great pains to list all the different ways and all the different pathways for you to be trained in crisis communications and emergency response, and I highly recommend them. And then we didn't talk about the county staff and their coordination because they weren't really brought into the incident response. You know, if they had been brought in, then we would maybe have talked about it a little bit more. So we encourage regular engagement with county staff so that there's interaction and communication where maybe county staff can help inform the decisions made by city staff. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dennis.
We're violating our clapping. You started.
Mayor, council members, Ms. Campbell, good evening. My name is Dennis Fagnant, and I'm the chair of the emergency response section. Like both briefings before you, it would be remiss if I didn't recognize Mr. Jay Dundas. What an amazing professional you have. So I certainly look forward to maybe attending another council meeting when maybe he's an employee that gets recognized for his work on this council. Additionally, I was able to speak with the mayor and Ms. Campbell during our proceedings. And what I would tell you is the leadership shown by both of these individuals trickled down to every single member of the staff. The level of
We already
professionalism.
heard about that.
The professionalism, their willingness to provide information, to figure out what we could do better in the future. That every single time, every single employee we spoke with, this was the trend. So thank you for that. And unfortunately, that's not the scope of our work. And so what I would like to preface before I get into mine is there was a lot of good things that happened during this. And unfortunately, our committee is not tasked with looking at that, but let's not lose focus of you have amazing people working for the city of Asheville. They did an amazing job. Not everything needs improvement. So let's recognize that right off the bat. So just to get into it, obviously we have myself, Rob Rissy, and Dirt Murphy. Dirt is the constant on this committee. We have these five major findings in the emergency response, and what I'll do is I'll just get right to the recommendations and then I'll highlight these findings before we talk about those recommendations. Okay, so incident command. Essentially incident command was not completely implemented during this incident. Incident command happens every single day within the city of Asheville. Your fire department, and to a very degree, your police department do it every single day. The beauty behind incident command is it's very scalable. And so for that very simple medical call or a public assistance, that one officer or that one unit that responds, one person's in command. And that scales up between a fire or what we have here, where every major component of ICS needs to be filled. And that's where we found ourselves, and unfortunately that did not happen. And so what we're recommending is to find that one ICS model. I think what you're gonna find, it already exists. So it's a matter of just training everybody to that incident command structure. ICS is very cumbersome, especially if you don't train on it. And that's the key, that's what you have to latch on to, is if you don't train on it, it's wildly cumbersome. And then in the middle of a crisis, if you're not used to it, you throw it out. You won't use it because it's just so cumbersome. But there are so many distinct, important aspects of incident command, from record keeping, to know what the plan is for that next 12 hours. And during that 12 hours, the next 12 hours you're planning for, and all the communications that you heard about today, it gets incorporated into the ICS system. Secondly, pre-plan. Kind of identify who's going to serve as your incident commanders. In this case, it may not have been Mr. Melton because there's maybe some decisions that needed to be made by Ms. Campbell or maybe by the mayor according to the emergency operations plan of the city or the continuity of operations, and we'll get to that. So you have to throw different people into those key positions, as we said earlier. Put yourself at that position of comfort. That way, in the middle of an event, you're capable of handling that emergency. Our second finding, there was really just inconsistent or a complete lack of training, and I think we recognize that. That's just not offered even to the members of the elected body. You just don't have the training in the ICS system. But in order to interact with the ICS system, you have to have that level of common terminology. How does the ICS system work? Again, the great thing about this, nothing needs to be produced. It's already out there. You just literally have to provide you with the details of how to get that training. And then I'm just going to keep saying, and to keep training on it, so it doesn't become cumbersome when you need to use it. You are in the midst of updating your emergency operations plan. So everything in ICS should be surrounded about what's in your emergency operations plan. You're already identifying areas in the city that have potential for problems, and so why not train for the potential of that occurring? And then you're already prepared. You're already a step ahead when that does happen. And then, again, you're going to hear that battle rhythm. Train, exercise, do it multiple times a year, incorporate more people. So no unified command. What is unified command? So what I would tell you is, let's go back to TV, because unfortunately that's what drives a lot of our perceptions. And so you think about your favorite law drama, and a local jurisdiction arrives on scene to whatever crime event, and then a federal 3-letter comes in and says, you're not in your jurisdiction, but it's my jurisdiction, and you have that interagency fight. That is not unified command. What it is two partners coming together because they share stakeholders in the event. And in this event, it did spill outside the municipal boundaries of Asheville. And so we had Buncombe County, we had Henderson County, excuse me, and then all your municipalities that also had water. They really need to seat at the table, just to make sure that their priorities, right? We recognize they too have priorities for their constituents, for their population. But on the better side of it is, what resources do they have to offer you? And so when those discussions are happening around the table, we have that. We can supply that for you. So again, with everything else, is make sure everybody that deserves a seat at the table has a seat at the table. And let's not view it through training that we're taking over. It's a joint venture to make sure we're simply doing what's right for our citizens. That's all unified command is. In the absence, I'll place some blame a little bit on Buncombe County. They should have come and kind of said, we want a seat at the table. They owe that to their residents as well, to say, hey, we have a stake at this. And so I would encourage in future events, whether it's water or anything else, that Buncombe County also steps forward and says, hey, look, we have an interest in this. How can we help, and how can we have a seat at this table? Lastly, our recommendation is forming a joint incident management overhead team. I'm proud to say I was able to take part in the COVID Emergency Operations Center that was set up by none other than your Chief Jeremy Knighton. He is a nationally recognized expert in incident command and works for you. He has the keys, he has the tools, he has the knowledge, he has everything to set this up. And what I'm also proud to say is this is really already underway. So the emergency response approach was appropriately guided by what I'll say is FEMA community lifelines, but it really failed to acknowledge the community perception in the reaction to the crisis. So very quickly, FEMA community lifelines, it's a measurement that will look in the fire department and say, what kind of immediate health hazards do we have, a loss of life? And so in this event, we adequately made sure that people's life were not in danger. And so what that did, it made that community lifeline maybe yellow when it came to water. So there was an impact, but there was really no threat of a loss of life to this event. That's very good, kind of behind doors in a planning session within the EOC, but what we have to always recognize as response professionals is what is the pulse of the public. And the public was telling us this was a very significant event to them. They didn't understand it, there was concerns, and so the response to this really should have taken on that more organic, we hear you, we understand you, we're here to take care of you, and not so much what we should do as emergency response professionals behind the scenes, like, we got this, we're good, we've got this under control, but the forward look should be very different and make sure that our community understands that we hear them. Again, you're gonna see some repetitions, won't go over it again. Activation of an EOC, again, this is your major think tank. This is your brain center. This is where we're coming up with the plans. An event of this scale, size, duration, it really deserved activation and bring all those people together. So this finding is essentially, we definitely had a problem, outdated and vague emergency operations and continuity plan. Again, what I would tell you is this is being done right now. Both your emergency operations plan and your continuity of operations plan is being recycled and looked at. So our recommendation is simply, it got outdated by a decade or so. So our recommendation is try to keep within that 5-year cycle of revision. They're big documents. And then what I would kind of pay attention to that we picked up that's still in the current EOP is vague language. And Mayor, this pertains to you. It says monitor the emergency response during disaster situations and provide direction where appropriate. I don't know what that means. I don't know what you're expecting your mayor to do, especially since we've not trained her in incident command. She doesn't have the knowledge of emergency response. So we should probably search that document, make sure that the language matches the exact responsibilities that you're placing. Granted, there's general statute that covers the declaration of emergency declarations and the powers of the mayor. Certainly, that's part of general statute. But we don't want to encumber any of you for responsibilities that you literally don't have the tools to encumber. And that is the conclusion of the emergency response and this presentation. All of us would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
First, we need to clap for you too. From all of us, I'm sure, I say this, we thank you so much for your work. You all have worked really hard, really long and quickly to provide this deliverable, and I think you have done exactly what we wanted and needed you to do. So terrific, great professional work. Thank you. So many of you made a trip here today, so thank you so much for doing that. And I know that you weren't here earlier, but we just had a council work session where we all generally already agreed about the fact that we're going to implement the recommendations that you're making. Council, they're here, and this is kind of a one-shot deal here in terms of the opportunity to have the whole task force here. So if there are questions, I don't know how you all want to do this, dance around the microphone, but if there are questions, I think this would be the opportunity to do that. So, you know.
I have just a couple. And actually, the first one might end up being something that could come back to us, because I don't know if that's really for David Melton. But I want to talk about very briefly the East Asheville pump station. I'd be interested in knowing why it was taken offline in 2010, and if the factors that were prevalent at that time are still the same today. So that's a David question, I guess. I don't know if it has to be today or not. But the East Asheville discussion is one that's a little more difficult for me to wrap my mind around. Because what I noticed is 2 modeling reports, one May 10th and the other one May 15th. And your ultimate recommendation is to study to see if we should have it back online. So when I look at page 34 of the report, it says, therefore the pump station had minimal benefit with the valve open. Using the pump station in combination with increased blank control valve flow had a marginal increase in pressures compared to the alternatives individually. So that sounds to me almost like it's saying it wouldn't have made a difference in this particular incident. But then another scenario is employed.
So I want to know, why wasn't the first
Right.
result good enough? And considering that we have two separate results, I'm wondering why the recommendation leans more towards the second. And then third, I'm going to end up asking David after we hear this, would that recommendation be the recommendation of our water department now? Thanks.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Thank you for reading it to that level of detail. I'll tell you this, we had a lot of discussion about the East Asheville pump station. At the risk of getting a little too far in the weeds, since you asked the question, let me answer it this way.
Okay.
When we met with Hazen, and we have great respect for their modelers, they're extremely good. We laid out about 3 or 4 different combinations of scenarios. And when you do computer modeling, it's endless how many scenarios you can come up with. So they did that. They presented that report to us, as you said, on May the 10th. We were in a compressed time frame, so we met with them on May the 12th and made sure that we understood what they did. The hang-up or the issue was what triggered that pump station to turn on, okay? What we really wanted them to do, although we may not have been explicit in our ask, was we want that pump station to be turned on the same way that it used to be turned on when it was in operation. In hindsight, I don't know that we spelled that out clear enough, because what they did was they used what I'll call a trigger that when the camber knob tanks got down to 15 feet. And we asked the modeler, why did you come up with that one? And they said, well, we weren't sure what to trigger it with, so that's what they came up with. Now the rub there is, and they modeled it that way, and it's scenario runs, and as you said, if you read the first draft, or the draft document, the one dated May the 10th, it reached a conclusion about the impact of the pump station based on that set of conditions. And we said, I understand that now, but that's never the way that it was triggered when it was used. So they said, okay, we understand that now. We'll go back and run it again. And it's fairly, once you do the setup, it's fairly easy to run these things. And the way that it was triggered in the past and the way they did it the second go-round, which led to the May the 15th report, was the trigger was a pressure at Hall Creek Junction, thank you. And when that set pressure reached 200 pounds, 200 PSI, then it would tell the pump station to turn on. So they did that the second time. Well, that meant that the pump station turned on at least 24 hours earlier. Does that sound right? About 24 hours earlier than it did during the May the 10th scenario run. Now, the reason that was critical is in the first scenario run, that pump station just sitting there waiting to come on. And in the second run, it came on much earlier. And that's why, and I appreciate you pointing out the wording differences in between the draft and the final, is in the final, I think they used a term or a sentence that said, the pump station improved system pressures significantly, or it improved system pressures. Now that was important to us because the whole problem here is that you lost what I would call as an engineer, hydraulic gradient downstream. And the whole pump station, the reason it was built in '92 was when it came on, it helped restore that hydraulic grade in the west and south. So I hope I didn't get too detailed there, but that's the reason between the two runs. And we wound up saying, well, let's just put both drafts in there, the first draft and the final draft. But you've hit on the difference between those two and what appears on the surface to be maybe two different outcomes or contradictory. They're really not, because it's all based on that trigger. So I apologize for the length of my answer, but that's the explanation.
Thank you.
And your, is that all of them?
And Mayor, I would ask if council wants us to respond tonight, or do you want us to respond later, or?
Well, I
how
think
would
for
you
some
want
of these information questions, the expectation would probably be later, but for the committee members, just as long as they're here, and I assume they don't want to keep coming back
Yeah, I have a
over.
couple.
Because I do want to find out if there's a reason that's not readily apparent to
Just
me
the historic reason.
why it was off.
Taken
and
down
if
in
those
2010.
reasons
Yes.
would
Yeah.
necessarily
I can
override
speak
the
to that.
likelihood of.
Our understanding, the pump station was built, you have to understand, the pump station was built prior to Mills River being built. So everything was coming from the northeast. It was specifically built to help overcome what we as engineers know of as head loss. That's frictional head loss when you flow water through a pipe. And the faster it flows or the longer distance it has to flow, there's more head loss. And it reduces that downstream hydraulic gradient. So if you read documents, and we had lots of documents to read, master plans going back decades, the original thought on the pump station was to help overcome that head loss between the plants in the northeast and the camber mob tanks in the far west. Now, to the city's credit, since it was first built, you've done quite a bit of piping upgrades, transmission system upgrades along that corridor. So bigger pipes, which means lower velocities, less head loss. So, and we talked at length with Mr. Melton and his staff, and when they said that we just didn't think we needed it anymore, what that tells me is they felt like they had done enough system upgrades, which they have done a lot, to minimize the need to overcome that head loss.
So it's not an instance, and maybe I'm just thinking about when I was coming out of college, when there's so much pressure on the east that stuff would explode and there'd be water all over. I mean, this has nothing to do with the report, this is just what I'm trying to.
I've always heard that.
Yeah. Sorry.
Good evening. No, that's
Going
fine.
in the
David
weeds.
Melton, Director of Water Resources. So the East Asheville Booster Pump Station actually predates me. So I have to query my staff on a lot of the reasons, but I think the reasons, it was basically decommissioned were the same thing that Ted was explaining. With all the system improvements, Mills River come online, and to my understanding, it was only used a few times after it was built. So, you got to decide, you've got this much money in your pocket, where are you going to put that money? Kind of thing, I believe is where a lot of the decisions were made. So some of those decisions were definitely budgetary. Was there another part that I missed?
Oh, I was gonna ask you what you thought about their recommendation, but you can write that and give it to us.
System redundancy is always a good thing to have. Doing a study to see what it would take. The project is in our master plan. The first part of that project is to actually put basically a pressure reducing valve in the yard of East Asheville Pump Station to lower the pressure. Because that was some of the information I got from staff is when it was run in the lower part of the system, which granted had older pipes at that time, would create more breaks.
Right.
And pressure tanks.
So, in the second part of that, there was a piece about refurbishment of the pump station. There was a price tag on it of under $500,000, and after I asked questions about that, because it seemed really low to me, that was just to reprogram the VFDs. And we got to remember too, the master plan we have now is still relevant, but it was done in 2019. So those prices are likely to be much more. But to do a preliminary engineering report to see what it would cost would give us the information to make those decisions. Do we spend the money for this, or would we spend it somewhere else? So. Thank you.
It looks like this is being debated behind you, though, amongst the engineers in the crowd.
I just have a couple possibly simple questions. The 24-inch valve that was found closed, what more do we know about it historically? Do we know when it was closed, when it was last inspected or anything? This may be a question for a response
Well,
later.
That was
they-
also my question.
Yeah, and they,
Yeah.
The one in the River Arts District?
Yes.
We talked to staff about that. We talked to Hazen about that as well. There was a main break, a 24-inch main break in 2018. Maybe in April. No? Okay. And it was suspected that, and this is not too uncommon, because when mains break, especially if they're large ones, you're closing valves to try to get the flow to shut off. It's not just the loss of water. On a main of that size, it is destruction of a roadway and any businesses that are close by. It's a lot of water. So you try to get them valved down as quickly as possible. You have protocols in place to log which valves are closed. It happens. You lose track that a valve got closed. And then the repair's made and all the valves are supposed to be opened back up. It's very possible, and I think staff generally would agree with this, although don't let me speak for you, that may have been the event where the valve got closed.
Okay.
Now,
But to your point, we're talking about like having historical memory. There's not a computer software or something that's saying, hey, on this date, so don't forget to open this back up.
no.
But some of this SCADA that you're referring to sounds like can be added for each of these. Okay.
Yes, yes, and that's one of the recommendations, is that any control valves, equip them so that they can be controlled by SCADA.
Okay.
So
And
yes.
then my follow-up question is for the other valve that was only at the 10%, thinking it was at 100%, I want to make sure I understood that correctly. So if I heard correctly, 100% would actually cause damage, perhaps throw too much water at a lower system. So we needed it to be dialed back, but maybe not to 10%? Or were you saying that potentially the 10% was a typo?
Oh, no, I'm not
Okay.
saying it's a typo.
Okay.
I'm saying that 10% was meaningful for the folks that operate the system.
Right.
I can see that happening within your SCADA system. The only problem that we had with it, and the reason that we're recommending that it be 0 to a true 100%, is that if
Institutional memory
it's
again.
10 years later,
Yeah.
somebody has to remember that is
Right.
only 10%. It confused us as a committee. We did not know that until Hazen told us that.
so if I understand you, you're looking at the system and it's telling you this valve's 100% open, but what it's defined as 100% is really only 10%. And
That is correct.
somebody
Right.
would have to know that. When that one says
Right.
100%, it really is only 10%.
Just like they'd have to remember that they closed that other one. So then if I heard you right, then if we wanted it to go above 10%, we actually need to do some safety protocols and make sure that we know how high it can go
That's
before
what- that's
creating
what you're
damage.
saying.
Okay.
Yeah, there's something downstream, it's probably a tank, a major tank, that if they just have it open, free-flowing, then it's gonna go to that point, and you can move a lot of water through these large diameter pipelines. So I'm sure that's why they did it. And if they open it to a true 100%, they're gonna have to do some kind of protocol or safeguards to prevent that from somebody making a mistake and just overflowing the tank or flooding something downstream. So yes, you understood that correctly.
In this list of recommendations, is there something that will get us past that idea that someone institutionally will have to remember that it's at 10%? Is a software tool going to be able to solve that?
I think so. I mean, the way
Okay.
I've seen it done, you leverage software as much as you can. The other part of a SCADA system that I did not mention is, and we saw this when we were at North Fork, they showed it to us. There's a user interface, so it's very visual. So you can have pop-up boxes, reminders, alerts, and anytime you do something, it may ask you a question to confirm that. Is this really what you wanted to do? And you could put a message in there that pops up to alert them that, hey, this valve is going to completely open to 100%. So I just use that as an example, and they can do that. They've got a very robust SCADA system.
Okay. One just last question, and thank you. Do we actually know how, we will never really know how many folks really lost water, is that right? We think maybe the AVL alerts was too high, but we don't actually know.
Well,
Is that
AVL
right?
alerts,
It was just
I
people
think
that
what
signed
they're
up.
saying
but-
is AVL alerts is not correlated with who
Right.
wasn't
That's just who
receiving
signed
water.
up online to get updates, but we don't actually know. Okay, and may never, okay.
But
Thank
with
you.
the new
Very
technology, we,
Mhm.
once fully implemented, we should have real-time knowledge about who does and doesn't have water.
Well, how do we know it's fewer than that number and not more than that number?
We don't. Just
He said-
anecdotally, it didn't seem that way.
Well, they said that during the presentation, that it was
Was fewer.
fewer, but good
Yeah.
question. How do they know?
They didn't know how long.
I think to address that question, one of our recommendations is to implement the radio reading meters. So that will give you better real-time information. And I'm sure David and his staff have gone back and looked at the meter records that you have through January and December, and they can
Right.
see where there was less
After the
usage
fact.
from customers. It won't tell exactly when they were out of water, but you will
See
see
the-
customers that use less water.
If there is some data that comes to light after all this that includes that, I would love to see it. I'm just kind of curious.
So that's why our recommendation is the committee for the, not only the AMI, but the zone meters. Your question about the south tunnel valve. By having a zone meter that reads the amount of water coming through that meter will allow the SCADA system to have more controls, and David and Bill and the operators have greater control of how much water goes to which section of the system.
Right.
And where it became important, as Ted said, the normal demands for the system were 21, 22 million gallons a day. Some percentage of that goes to South Buncombe, which is being supplied by the 5 million gallons out of the Mills River. When it goes offline, we have to provide that coming from North Fork and DeBrule. So implementing more meters gives the operators more control.
Thank you.
I have a follow-up about the valve that was out in the River Arch District, and maybe it's not for today. But I am curious because we've been having issues with our water system during that period of time. Whether it's the South Side, Chicken Hill, River Arch District, East West Asheville Neighborhood Association, I got all those alerts like over the past 4 years. So do we know if there has been a consistent issue with that valve? Did this report uncover something, or is that something that we need to look at moving forward?
I'll have to defer to.
Yeah, typically, they're hard to know that a closed valve exists. Because under normal demands, and during the 9 month, I think it was 9 months, that they ran without Mills River, there didn't seem to be any grave indication that there was a problem. You need it, but it becomes more evident at high demand because you just can't supply enough water. But that doesn't, the high demands don't happen very often. Now they're higher during the summer because people are using more water. And I think that's when they first picked up on it, that in June and July of I've forgotten which year afterwards, may have been 2019 as well, that they noticed the Candler knob tanks were dropping, so they weren't riding at this normal elevation. That was a good catch on their part, and they asked Hazen to do some modeling to try and identify what would cause that. So the way a modeler does that is they try to start changing things in their setup to make the tanks behave the way they are in actuality. And you can reduce pipe diameters if you have buildup within a pipe, usually not in a 24, but you change roughness coefficients. You change all these different setup parameters, and if you still can't replicate it, you start closing off pipes. You close a valve. And when the modeler did that, then the tank behaved the way it was behaving. So I think that's why they suspected that, we think there's a high probability you may have a closed valve. So, no, they're not easy to just go out there and find. And there's not many, I was a little surprised with 20,000 valves that they don't have more valve crew personnel. That's a lot of valves.
And they're not like GIS tagged, or, they're not, we don't know where they are.
I think they are.
Okay. Made it sound like we didn't really know.
It sounds like we know where they are, there's just a lot of them, and we don't have
There's a
data
lot
on
of them.
all of them.
Yes, if they're 6 and 8 inch diameter, they're not as critical and you can survive when some of those are closed. It's hard to survive during high demand when the big ones are closed. Yeah, I think that was our number one recommendation, was a valve assessment program. And you can contract it out and get it done for not inordinately expensive.
What does that mean, not expensive to you? I'm just curious.
Depends on the size of the valve.
Okay.
It might be a few $100s per valve.
Oh,
The big ones might be $1,200 to $1,500,
Okay.
in my experience. So it's well worth the investment,
It sounds
because you
like it.
see what impact it can have if they're closed.
So with this River Arts District valve, am I hearing right? So in general, there's maybe 20,000 valves. It's very hard to locate. There's so many. But in the report, it mentioned that we had outside consultants give us information that there was probably a valve closed in the River Arts District. And we had that information for some time. Is that right?
Well, she didn't, let me say this.
Yeah, help me understand what I was reading in the report about that.
Keep in mind, what they're saying is the only way I can get your tanks to replicate in the model what they're doing in actuality is to close off the 24-inch line somewhere.
Wow.
So she suspected that it was in the River Arts District, which there's multiple large valves in the River Arts
They
District.
got in January 2022.
I'm not sure when the work authorization was issued to Hazen to do that level of work. The presentation to staff didn't occur until January the 10th of 2022. Now, one thing I didn't mention, and I do think this played into it, it was a virtual presentation. It wasn't face-to-face. It could be as simple as it just didn't get communicated real well. I don't think it got to the people that we were confident could do something about it because they weren't familiar with the presentation, nor the location that she cited. I think that was just a breakdown in communication, and it was an unfortunate one. I do think that when we asked staff, they said, yes, we looked for it, but we could not find it. Being at a utility for 37 years, I understand that happens. Let me say this about valves. One thing that occurs when you hire a company to assess your large valves, the first thing they have to do is find them. And that sounds simple. It could be that the valve box lid cover has been paved over. It could be that it's been filled over. And you can't just walk up to it. So you have to first locate it. Then you have to make sure that you can get a key on it. Usually the valve box is full of dirt. So you got to get a vacuum truck out there to clean the box out. So that's what you do. And then you get a GPS coordinate on that particular valve. And you want to make sure that it's mapped visually correct in your GIS system. And you do all this stuff because the last thing you want to have somebody to do on Christmas morning is to be out there in the dark looking for a valve that has not been pinpointed. So it sets them up to be successful when you do all of that. And it's not a one-time thing. You have to do this periodically.
So we don't have all our valves mapped.
Well,
Although
I'll say this, I assume they're mapped. They may not be mapped with a GPS
right.
coordinate.
Specific.
But I thought earlier you were saying that this particular valve might have been closed related to a 2019 incident, and so probably wasn't paved over. It obviously wasn't, since we managed to find it.
Correct. I was just giving a hypothetical situation. It's not as easy as just walking up there and
Right.
putting a key on it. You have to do all those steps, and that's what your contractor's doing. Now, some of the valves, they'll be broken. They won't work. They could be what we call spins free, which is they put a key on it, it just sits there and spins. Nothing's happening.
So what you're describing is helpful to really understand the detail of the recommendation that you're talking about of starting a valve program, right? Like this isn't, there's a lot of labor to it. There's a lot of mapping to it. And so hearing that detail is really helpful. And I guess also hearing, I don't know, I still am having a tough time.
Did you get
that,
the
like,
answer to your question?
I
though,
don't
the
know that I
duration?
did, because I feel like we
Yeah.
hired professionals to help us understand what was happening in the River Arts District, and then that
Well,
information.
But how
it was a
long, though?
system-wide, I think it was a system-wide analysis that pinpointed that the closed valve was somewhere in the river.
What I heard you ask though was when did we find out and when did we open it?
We found out in January 2020, and we opened it an hour after
No,
someone.
no,
identified it.
2022. It was 11
Right.
months prior to the event.
Yeah, so it just
Wait,
seems
wait,
like
we've-
in the absence of a valve program,
Yeah,
professionals helped us identify that this is a system vulnerability, and that
We couldn't find
information
it.
just didn't get to the right people
I
until
don't-
we were in a
I guess I got
crisis.
here in January.
That was
Kind of.
our subcommittee conclusion, is that there was a breakdown in communication for the field personnel that are intimately familiar with those valves.
It seems like there's also kind of a general assumption that because we have such a great deal of capacity in our system that, some of these issues may be overridden by the fact that we have a lot of capacity. And so that manages a lot of these, if there's a break or there's a valve broken or something like that. I don't know if that's correct or not, but maybe that was a working assumption.
It could be. I mean, you have capacity. Even after you lost Mills River, you had enough capacity. So, yes, but you have to be able to get it into the system.
Deborah, this is not related to the report, but since it seems so difficult to find the valve, I'd be interested in knowing how it was found, who found it, and if we need to have some type of employee recognition.
I mean, I was here.
And the 10%, the 10%'s not 100%, or 100%'s 10%.
On that cheery note, I do want to add one thing. There's a page on communications, the first 72 hours, and the sentence really stood out to me, and I just want to make sure it was said aloud. The city manager was involved early in the response. Contrary to coverage, the city manager carried out proper response role, especially related to communications. The city manager does not serve in a communications role during a crisis. And I really appreciated hearing that statement, because I know for me, this was a big learning curve, still learning from it. But it was, and I didn't know how our city manager should have handled it, so it was helpful to me to hear that she actually did her job right.
Well, and I think you're highlighting an interesting point, because we certainly have had mixed press coverage on at least, I'm not sure it's the public or it's the press's perception of what the role of a city manager is in these crises. So I think that's helpful to have that feedback. I will say, I appreciate the feedback around crisis communications and what the best practice is. I worry a little bit, though, that the perception of the public and what the public thinks is a best practice in terms of communication is not necessarily in sync, I think, with sort of the textbook teaching around communication. So David, I'm just making a general comment. You don't have to stay up there unless you want to.
I was just going to add something.
Go ahead.
Please finish.
Okay, well, I was thinking about this. Our state has experienced the COVID crisis in the last couple of years, and we had a pattern throughout that COVID crisis where the governor would host a press conference and speak to us, and he would have Mandy Cohen, famous Mandy Cohen, who was actually in charge of directing the COVID response. And they spoke at these press conferences on a very regular basis, and locally, our communications team for COVID locally was me, the chair of the county commission, sometimes Avril, sometimes Deborah, but often the health department director. So I think the public has gotten used to seeing this communications effort around emergencies, and that's the expectation they have. So I'm looking forward to us coming up with, and I know we already do have some plans already in writing. Whether or not we use them or not, I actually don't know. But I look forward to us fine-tuning our emergency response, whether it's the last part of this presentation around the actual physical response with a crisis team and the countywide emergency response team, and communications. as well as communications, but I'm hopeful that our plan works to incorporate what is the best practice, keeping in mind what the community also expects in terms of what they experience in terms of services and communication. So I just say that, and you know, I say that on really especially, and I'm glad you highlighted this, Sage, because I think the city manager has received you know, a lot of coverage about what should a city manager do and not do, and when should they be public or private or communicating with the public. And certainly, I think Ms. Campbell, the way she manages and the way Avril Pender manages the county is very much the way that managers are taught to do that through the North Carolina School of Government and other education entities in North Carolina. But again, not always what the press or the public might decide they think should be the way it's done. So, but at the end of the day, we've got to provide quality services to our constituents, and a water outage of this magnitude is not meeting that requirement of delivery of services to our residents, to our businesses. This was a very frantic experience for me and for all of us and for our community. You know, personally, and I know you all got a lot of communications from constituents wanting to know what was going on. I had restaurant owners calling me, asking me, you know, when can they open, and they're losing thousands of dollars and their staff's not making any money. It was the Christmas holiday week. People had family and visitors in town. You know, every hotel room was probably booked, I'm assuming. So it was a pretty frantic and confusing situation internally. And I think what we've heard a lot in this report is, well, that was experienced as well by the public. And so we need to do better. And again, I want to thank the task force for all their hard work, because I think you're really helping provide us with a roadmap for how to do that. David, you wanted to add something?
I did. I wanted to step back to the valve question that we were talking about earlier. We actually have a valve program where we have a valve crew that goes out and does what we call gridding. But, and this is going to sound like an excuse, but it's in reality, due to staffing, they get pulled in a lot of different directions to do a lot of different work. And I wanted to extend a thank you, because in of approving our fees and charges, we are now getting another crew, if we can recruit them and retain them, another crew to do that. So actually the valve crew can do what they are designed to do. And we've walked through, the staff has improved the SOPs and the process, digitized what we call valve log sheets. So if a valve's turned off, it's recorded, it's attached to the work order. Not only does it help being turned back on, because at times if you have a shift change between, if a crew reaches their 16 hours, another crew comes in, if you don't have that solid record, you can miss a valve. And things like that happen. So definitely I want to say thank you for that. And also I want to say publicly thank you to the committee for all the hard work. Most of this was pro bono, and I think we've got some very good recommendations to move forward. So thank you.
Oh, do we clap for David too?
I have a question about.
I think this gentleman here. Come on up to the mic though, so we can, otherwise folks out in the online cannot hear you.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Vice Mayor, Council people, Mr. Brown, Campbell, howdy Maggie. My name is Mike Holcomb. I'm a resident of the city of Asheville. I'm a former director of the Water Resources Department. I'm also a residential customer who was without water for 5.5 days.
Oh, boy.
They want to make a brief comment here. The only thing I would try to augment what you've been told is specifically about the East Asheville Booster Pump Station. I was at a point in my career where I was fortunate enough to be the construction manager for that project. And apparently, we have found out that when I became the director of the Water Resources Department, apparently I'm the only other one that's ever had an occasion to use that pump station. So I'd just like to clarify a couple of things that I've heard, that I don't want to leave you with information that's at variance with what you have. The pump station was built in order to get the full 36 million gallons of water into the system, and it was designed to do that automatically. The 200 PSI trigger that they talked about, that's what the system pressure normally is. When system demand gets really high, that pressure falls, and when that pressure falls, it affects the ability to refill those tanks. So what the pump station does is merely restore that amount of lost pressure. It doesn't overpressurize and cause leaks. It just restores the pressure that's there. I've got to point out to you on the reports that you have, the May 15th report is the report. It's the one that's sealed by Hazen as professional engineers. The May 10th report was just a draft. So you really need to look at the May 15th report, and specifically I'd like to call your attention to the last 3 slides of their presentation, where they model the effect of the 24-inch valve that was closed being open and the operation of the pump station when operating correctly at 200 PSI. If each of you would look at that, it also shows you the tank levels during the event.
So you're not talking about the slides we just saw?
No, I'm
You're talking
about
about Hazen's presentation and the last 3 slides of Hazen's presentation to the staff. Yeah,
that was given to
sorry.
council.
I saw-
Yes, okay.
Scroll.
And if you look at that, and I've just got to point it out to you based on what I've heard, you'll see that there wouldn't have been an outage. The tank levels in the South Buncombe Reservoir never got below half full. Canner Knob reservoirs never got below 25 or 30 feet full.
There would not have been an outage.
Would not have been a system outage if the pump station had been operational and the valve in question had been open. And Hazen's model shows that clearly.
Yeah, okay, so not just the valve, but actually bringing the East Asheville pump station
It's in the
online.
material that you've got.
Yeah,
And so I
yeah,
just
okay.
wanted to point that out to you. In my opinion, as the former director, as the person that built that pump station, and as a customer that didn't have water for 5 or 6 days, unless and until you put the booster pump station back online, the system remains vulnerable. If the same thing happened again, and Mills River went offline and you had high demands, and you didn't have the pump station operational, you wouldn't be able to get that water back into the system, and the same thing could occur again. That's why Hazen, it's one of 3 recommendations that Hazen makes, is to go ahead and do whatever needs to be done for emergency situations such as we had at Christmas. So I just wanted to make sure that
Thanks.
the council had that information.
Jade looks like he's ready to vault out of his seat.
City Council, we appreciate your time today. This has been a very lengthy presentation for you. That you have the report and the presentation. That's the collective findings and recommendations of the committee. There were a lot of deliberation about these findings, and so you definitely have the report as it stands in the final conclusion of the committee, and we do thank you for your time.
I had one more question. I hear we're trying to finish it out, and it's a future, just get back to us. I just wanted to hear more about, not tonight, but the Mills River plant, what the future planning for it is the winterization, et cetera, if we do plan.
And the
I'd seen there somewhere, but,
recommendations.
yeah.
Yeah.
And we don't have to
While we
discuss
the
it now.
comms plan here,
Yeah.
Team Kira, can I ask a comms question?
Yeah.
So while I was out helping people flush toilets over the holidays who didn't have access to water, I happened to realize that you'd have one neighbor who doesn't have any social media and one neighbor who's only relying on social media. And we had folks in South Asheville that didn't have heat because their heat was relying on their water heater. So we're, in a lot of ways, lucky that we're learning a lot of these big lessons when we didn't have multiple layers of crisis. But I'm wondering if anyone in the comms team has like recommendations on what other cities are doing when we've got to pivot to being able to 1990 style phone tria situation if there's not electricity, and or meet people where they are on different social media channels. Who's doing a great job?
Well, this was part of our findings in Austin, Texas. So I think I sent my report around early on. I can resend that to you, because what happens when you're back to the Stone Age of the 1990s, is
The
that
late
you do have,
1900s.
you do have to be more personal. And this is where comm staff, and I understand CAPE, in part of our discussions, it didn't really drill down to it. They have good relationships with the community. So what you do in those situations is part of the overall effort to improve your comms, crisis comms, is to have those ties in the community. Who are your community leaders? Elected officials, you have your constituents, you have ways of putting it out there. That's why communication with you during a crisis is important, but it has to be managed properly. But you have, faith-based organizations, all sorts of community organizations that you can work with, where it is kind of that phone tree. But as a former news producer, one of the best ways to do that, and to get out that word to everybody on top of, because staff, you only have so many staff that can operate a phone tree or get the word out. I've done it with limited staff. Is to get the word out to the press, is to bring them early, to be communicating with them throughout, because they're going to use their social media as well. They're going to use their contacts. Because as we discovered, I didn't get into this report for time, many of you found out from calls from your constituents. The press found out through calls into their newsrooms. That's how the word got out about how bad this was getting. So mass media is big, community relationships are strong, but Kate, that's one way. When I did my interviews, I feel confident they have those relationships in the community. They just have to tie it into the overall crisis communications effort.
And I hope we can take those recommendations that other cities are learning from crisis back to our emergency response, because I know there was a lot of question about, were we meeting people who don't speak English? Were we meeting
Right.
residential and commercial renters? Like, who was falling through the gap? And I think it would be helpful to know which cities are making those pivots and planning in advance.
Cities with high rental communities, there is no silver bullet. Austin, Texas is a great example. 50% of their community are renters. So you have to work with property managers. You have to, HOAs get out information to their large areas. But if you have property managers who have over 100 apartments, they're a top target as well. You're not going to hit everybody. It's just, when you have that high rental community, you just don't have the natural flow of a water department, the billing information where you can get out communications to people. Asheville Alerts is very helpful. You put out word, sign up for Asheville Alerts, but it's still a secondary system. Those primary systems do flow mass media, your outlets that you control, consistent, constant information that goes out with important facts. If you don't have any facts that have changed, you still do another update, and you provide the fact that this is still ongoing so that there isn't a gap in communication, because we know when there's a gap in communications, this is where people will go, and they're not going to get the right information. So, but to go back to close about the Stone Age, those community relationships are important. Your relationships with your constituents, the community outreach. But that's where we felt staff, in particular, comm staff, was particularly strong. They just need a good process to put those strengths into play.
Mayor, if I could, I just wanted to, on behalf of city staff, to thank you all. We are committed to taking a much, much deeper dive of the study, understanding essentially strengths and weaknesses, and unfortunately, and apparently, there were a couple of weaknesses in our system, but I think council and particularly staff are committed to making the type of necessary changes and upgrades, but I want to caution the community. It's not going to happen overnight. There's a lot in this report, and there's a lot of budgetary consideration that needs to be made, but we are committed. And I would suggest also that we come back, Mayor, with like a work session or as part of an agenda briefing, and just have a much deeper dive about, kind of what are some short-term things that we need to do immediately, because I think they recommended some immediate things we need to undertake. The last thing that I would say is a part of the budget process. You all have a number, and David just mentioned one of the things that are recommended, as part of the budget that you all will be hopefully adopting tonight as it relates to water. There's a communication specialist position. There is additional crews for this and for water treatment plant operations. So we're taking some good steps, but obviously there's a lot more that we need to do. But I just wanted to thank you all.
Thank you. So process-wise, council, what the city manager just talked about is having some kind of a work session or follow-up where staff's able to digest in the 3 different areas, short-term, long-term recommendations, and kind of a game plan for implementation in each of the areas. So
A friendly amendment coming off of earlier today, us spending a lot of time talking about our role in goal setting is for us in that work session to talk about goals. You know, when I hear a lot of these recommendations, what I hear is that we want to strive for a resilient, redundant, well-resourced, and well-managed water system. And so just getting into what the policy direction at that goal level is while understanding what your recommendations are to implement and what resources it might apply could be really helpful in that type of work session.
I'll probably need you to translate that, what you just said during the work session, but sounds very positive.
And Mayor, just one last thing. We did send out an email to county manager and managers of the other communities and towns that are affected by our water system, and offered for staff to come and meet with their staff so that we can go through this, particularly related to the communications piece.
And I would assume the emergency response.
Absolutely.
As well. Okay, great. Okay, we're gonna now do things that aren't related to water, so this is your opportunity to flee, but again, thank you so much.
3 cheers for dirt, too.
I know, really.
Seriously, really, really important glue in that.
Water. So that's water, okay. Family members.
I kind of want to do that too, actually. I'm going to do that. Yeah.
Did you get my message about this other item?
It's simple.
But it's not in the language, so it's gonna have to be added in 3 places if we agree. It was implied.
Yeah, okay. We're there.
Yes.
We're doing it.
And they know.
Yeah.
So.
Maggie, you're gonna have to go shush everybody, but, yeah. Sorry.
I wanted to offer that first gentleman that was speaking, he kept coughing, and I just really wanted to offer him the irony.
Okay, we're on to our public hearings portion of our agenda, and thank you, Maggie, for doing that. We have, the first item, I'm just gonna do a quick motion to continue that first item, is a public hearing to consider the adoption of the South Slope Neighborhood Vision Plan, and we need to continue this to July 25th, 2023. Do I have a motion?
I'll move.
And a second? Okay, we have a motion and a second. Shanika's seconded, right?
No, it's Kim.
Oh, you threw your voice. Okay. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. We are missing Maggie.
She, Councilmember Braun just stepped into the hall with Deborah to thank the water committee.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Well,
Clear vote counts.
Maggie.
Okay, so we're ready to hear item B, public hearing to consider an amendment to the Unified Development Ordinance for the purpose of revising neighborhood meeting requirements for level 2 projects, major subdivisions, and conditional zonings. And Chris Collins is here to present this item.
All right, good evening, Mayor, Council. I'm Chris Collins with the city's Development Services Department, and I'm going to take you through a few slides describing this amendment to the UDO aimed at creating more specific requirements for pre-development community meetings. First of all, as stated, this is going to create stronger, more followable requirements for the pre-development community meetings that are held before the city receives an application for a level 2 major subdivision or conditional zoning project. And bringing forward some specific code language where we currently have general code language that has brought about some challenges in communication between prospective developers, the city, and neighbors. And tell you about these amendments that staff has worked with the Coalition of Asheville Neighborhoods, the Development Customer Advisory Group, and the Legacy Neighborhoods Coalition, among others, in developing. All right, so highlighting a couple of the proposed changes, first of all, right now, all property owners within 200 feet are required to be noticed outside of the CBD. And I'm going to tell you about the CBD regs and the outside of the CBD regs differently, and I'll dig into that central business district zoning difference in a little bit. We are proposing that that would move to 400 feet outside of the CBD, and if I flip back real quick, you'll see a 200 foot on this random parcel that we selected here would notify 43 parcels, property owners, and under a 400 foot scenario, we'd be looking at 77. So it doesn't span that radius a little more. The groups we worked with felt that would more properly inform the neighbors and neighborhoods. And again, I will come back to the CBD zone properties. The other change I want to highlight is the change in the timing of the notifications that the neighbors receive. Right now, the ordinance calls out for a 10-day notification, and then, of course, a 10-day waiting period before the meeting happens. Simply, we want to change that to 14 days for a full 2 weeks for folks to adjust their schedules, make these meetings, and interact with these prospective developments. There are a few other changes, go over real quickly. Right now, the ordinance describes a location and time to be designed to be convenient. We're not proposing a change to that, and I put that up just to say that is a really hard thing to codify. We made many efforts, but depending on where you are and where somebody works, a location and time designed to be convenient can mean many different things for a 9 to 5er than it may mean for somebody who works 5 to 12. So we ended up not proposing a codified change there. Right now, there's no registration requirement, meaning the city does not know when these meetings are occurring. We do ask that they be registered, and that happens sometimes. But the ordinance change would require these meetings to be registered with the city, which would help staff react to questions that we received, among other things. Limited reporting happens at application intake right now. The ordinance would propose that these meetings be reported after they happen on a form provided by the city, so we can standardize the information that's being collected. We already covered the 200-foot notification radius to 400 outside of the CBD zone, and the 10-day to 14-day. We do not, as a city, require any sign or notice templates, but we have created those and are, with the ordinance amendment, would ask that developers use those templates, again, to standardize the information that is going out there. Right now, there is no notification of registered neighborhood associations. This amendment does propose that email notice to neighborhood associations be required. And that one's in there twice, I don't know why, disregard it. There is no guidance currently for developers or neighbors, so something we worked on extensively over the development of this ordinance was a best practices guide for both developers and neighbors who are participating in these meetings. That's been published on our website since November 1st. Quite simply, the change here is that this ordinance would codify and say that developers shall follow the best practices established in the guide. So it would give us, as staff, when an application comes in, a better opportunity to evaluate whether or not these meetings meet code. Talking about CBD zoning, I said a few times we talk about this. Right now, the CBD zoning downtown requires that all addresses rather than property owners within 200 feet be notified of a proposed development. And we have left that at 200 feet for a couple of reasons. Downtown is our densest area in the city, and that 200 feet casts a really wide net right now. And we felt like that notice was probably appropriate in that instance. This is also a good time to talk about that we did weigh at some point. We've been going through this, developing guides, templates, and signs for a couple of years now with the groups we've been working with. We weighed the whole, should we take that all addresses concept rather than property owners outside of the central business district?
Yes.
We did not arrive there, although happy to
I'd
answer
like
any
to make a
questions on it.
suggestion tonight about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But, so
He
this
knows.
one, this is for the CBD though.
This
not
is
We're
for
talking
the
about
CBD.
outside,
The
talking
CBD.
everywhere.
Yeah.
We'll let you get through your presentation.
So
I guess.
CBD right now does say all addresses, right? Outside
But-
of CBD,
but
it says
not
property
outside.
owner.
Is everybody understanding that? Like, tax record might be the owner in Jersey.
Right.
Right.
But in CBD, the owner in Jersey gets a letter, but so does the address in Asheville.
Every address, so every business, apartment, residential unit
Yeah.
would be covered.
In case you're the
Right,
renter.
and as it stands now, that's not the way outside of downtown, right? So we ended up not proposing a change there in this iteration right now. And the reason, well, we've been 2 to 3 years working through this, so we've had a lot of different people involved at different times.
So a lot of different reasons.
There are a lot of different reasons. One of those is kind of status quoting it. It's the ordinance, and we know what's coming. A lot of you are familiar with the simplicity notification system. One that leads great into this. Future phase, we're planning on, as the city brings on a new permitting system, and that's something that's getting responses to an RFP right now, is to expand that system to notify anyone who registers of these neighborhood meetings as well. But that was kind of all right, this was downtown. It at least used to be very problematic for our developers and folks to get those addresses. I believe that can be solved. But let's keep it how it is, and let's continue with the simple city notification rollout so we can make sure everybody knows what's happening when. So timing on that kind of
So
thing.
you're saying, just to be clear, you're saying the Simply City will probably take care of this, but that would still be a sign-up process,
It'll be
not an
opt-in.
automated.
It is an
Yeah.
opt-in.
I mean, if they're, it seems like if they're able to do it for downtown,
And
I
haven't
mean,
heard-
downtown, you're talking about, if you have an apartment building downtown, they have to send it to the property owner, so that's gonna be whatever
That's correct.
company
Yep.
that
And the
owns the
physical address.
the building. But, and then each apartment
Yep.
in the building, I mean, it seems like they can do that. Doing it outside the
Anywhere.
CBD would be less difficult. You're still gonna have apartment buildings.
Sure.
But we also, we just had this conversation with the water, and it's like, are we gonna reach renters? What about people who don't have a way that Simple City is gonna?
Right, that's
That's why
what
the address
we're
is-
saying,
Yeah,
is
we're,
that it should be
yeah,
required.
I mean,
It's pretty
tell
obvious
us more
when we
about
add
the
it.
thinking about why, I mean, I get we're doing some work here at the
Right.
city and we're gonna do, but otherwise, why wouldn't we have the same requirement outside the CBD in terms of who gets notification?
What I'll say is.
Yeah,
that
I know this is
yeah.
not, you are merely carrying forward.
As,
yes.
well, as someone who's been shepherding this through the whole time, I wouldn't have a problem as long as I felt like we could help people serve that information up.
That's the difference.
From an equity perspective, because not everyone who applies for development is a developer.
So it could be too onerous for some, like some small, well, they have to hit a level 2, so.
A little guidebook, though, to your point, would help. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not hard to go into our side of the county, yeah.
I think it is a problem with a solution, so,
Yeah.
take that as it is. As kind of the project manager of this text amendment, I'd have no problem, going back and drafting it up to.
You know, as the design committee board member and the downtown board member, I haven't heard any pushback. You know, I was there when we made this change, and I had mistakenly thought that it was citywide. That's why I flagged this tonight, but, so I haven't heard any bad feedback from developers that it was hard or anything. I don't know why we wouldn't.
Council sounds like they're pretty interested in making that
Hey.
change to this change.
Well, I will say that, one, the consistency, I think, would help people, hopefully would help staff too, feel like this is the process, not this is the process for one neighborhood downtown and this is the process for the rest of the neighborhoods, just one. It would help the expectation of the public, but also, I'm pretty sure maybe 10 years ago, I went to like a local mail company, and you just draw the boundary, like your neighborhood association, you can send a postcard to everyone, like, there's got to be a way to do
There is.
this. But I would support
Yeah.
consistency.
Yeah, and I think what we used to hear about the problems people encountered with the downtown requirement was more about making sure, so when they submit that application, that it matches what we, the city, tell them they should be doing.
Right.
But that's something, again, I think it's a problem with a solution.
Well, and now that we're almost 50% renters, we probably need something like this for the actual people impacted to be aware, you know?
So, just as we work through this, that would be, I would really like to see that change to it.
think it requires 3 updates in your world.
Yeah, and that's something we could, see if council is of the mind.
Well, you'll have to decide if that's substantial enough to have to go back to P and Z,
Oh.
right?
So there's no requirement that even with a substantial change, that a proposal like this go back to P and Z. It's up to the purview of council to decide if you would like additional recommendations and analysis from that body. They've already fulfilled the requirement by looking at it once, and it's not uncommon for changes in whatever the proposal coming before P and Z to the time it reaches council without it going back to P and Z. So it's up to you to determine if you feel that's necessary.
Thank
You
you.
don't, okay. Let's let you finish your.
That's
those
really
are-
it. Yeah.
I'd be happy to make a
Oh,
motion. to
wait, I
that.
have one other question though before
I
that
still would like
happens.
more discussion about that equity portion, though. Can you just delve into that a little bit
Yeah,
more? In
well-
what circumstances would it be disadvantageous and to whom?
Access to a computer.
So we have, granted, most of the applications we see for level 2 and above are larger operations, engineering firms and all that. But we do get, over the years, we get a few small conditional zonings, property owner on their own, who's not doing much of a development, they're gonna trip these requirements. I'm trying to think of specific.
You could have, I mean,
examples.
right now under our ordinance, if you wanted to do a short-term rental, aren't you? You would,
Yeah.
you would, I mean, we haven't ever had that happen yet where an individual came to council, but theoretically that would trip the requirement.
Is there not a Simply City tool that can do that? Grab the parcels?
Not yet. Oh, we'll grab parcels, ownership.
You can grab parcels on the
and
GIS.
ownership- Well, that's the thing, but if the Simply City is so much easier to use for the average person. But if the Simply City can flag and buffer and pull addresses, then you can tell if it's somebody in Jersey or if it's the address in Asheville. It might be easier, but you would have to have access to a computer, internet, and be able to.
But what happens if if you realize the property owner's in New Jersey and you need to get the, if
Send
it's
it
the
to
single
Jersey
home,
and the
it's
address.
easy because you just serve the street address.
Yeah.
And the owner of record in New Jersey or whatever. The problem is if you have multifamily apartment or something and you don't have a way to get,
Registered mail to all apartment people.
Well, so right now, it's just a first-class mail.
it's first, yeah, it's not
not
registered
registered.
mail. I mean, you could figure it out. You're just saying there's small applicants that don't have a big
Yeah.
budget and they trip the requirement and suddenly they need a team to figure out how to mail all these people. Doesn't
Probably
happen
pretty
often, but
few
it could
and far
happen.
But I think from a city perspective, we have staff that could reach out and offer assistance. I'd love to
Do you-
focus on doing something with a tool that
Yeah.
made that easy.
I mean, it's like a 5-minute thing. if
I
you
mean,
know what
could
you're
there
doing.
be like would you just do that for any applicant who requested the assistance?
I guess if we're gonna do it for someone.
No, well, no, I don't mean do it for
Someone that
everybody.
had
If people have the
Would
capacity
we?
to do
Yeah.
it, I'm just saying, would you assist someone who didn't have the?
For that
Well,
little
yeah,
one person,
Of
yeah.
course, yes, definitely.
It's a pretty quick thing. 5
Well,
minutes.
400 feet could be a lot of, I mean, I see what you're saying.
But on
It could-
staff side, it's a click of a mouse and a button and a spreadsheet, it's done. It's fast.
I mean,
Anyways.
why do you think that?
Because I had to do it, because I know how to do it.
You're,
It's okay. It's just pulling addresses, but
Probably, yes. Probably.
Could
can
we
be
send it to
easy.
P and Z to get them to have this conversation and make a recommendation? If we make that change?
I mean, I think what you're saying is, if you do have folks that, they're doing something relatively small, but they trip the requirement, we've had conditional zoning applicants like, a dental office needed to get a rezoning and they had a sidewalk thing and,
And they had a-
they needed a conditional zoning, so I could see scenarios where it triggers a pretty burdensome notification process, but I think you're saying you would assist them in getting a list of addresses.
Yeah, we do now, when it's the property owners involved, or even if it's downtown, if somebody needs assistance, we already do and we can. Just want to make sure we are always prepared in
And I
doing so.
think the alternative is that only property owners are getting notified of this, and that feels pretty unfair, right? So if we move it to the resident, maybe there's a really conscientious property owner out there that will then email their tenants and say, hey, I got this notice, this is relevant to you, but I
they
would
might
bet that doesn't happen much, and so.
So I'm in agreement with you on that. I'm just
Yeah.
thinking about what could go wrong and
I appreciate that lens.
is disadvantaged as a result. So I'm thinking about the smallest one.
Well, does this
But I'm in
focus-
agreement
Yeah.
that would be the goal, but I just think of the other side
Yeah.
always, like unintended consequences and potential unintended harm. And I just don't know
That's a
yet
good point.
what those could be.
Keep in mind, it's the level 2 threshold too, so 20,000 square feet. Yeah, so not like.
But I know a funeral home director who's a small business owner.
Yeah,
Who's kind of like just starting out, so does that,
But can't you program it where it actually, should be able to program this where it actually, if someone, the property owner is out of town, it can actually take those and send it to the property and just have occupant, so they can send it without sending it to the out of town.
Sorry, we're making it hard on you, but I think our goal here is we want it done. Maybe we need to hear from them.
And the thing is, because you don't have to, if someone's out of town, you can just change it in the program that someone, the owner, if it's out of town, can have it sent to the property.
We're gonna drive them crazy, but
So-
what's easiest for you? Would you rather
What would
come
you
back
recommend?
with a,
I would honestly, I would recommend just requiring all addresses for both inside and outside of CBD zoning.
both?
okay.
Yeah, okay, so let's do it. He said both.
I'll make a motion.
Are we there?
Well, one more question. We got an email today actually complaining about the community meeting being moved to an online meeting. What do we say about the requirement of in-person versus online meetings?
Sure. So obviously that started in 2020, right? With COVID and
Obviously, yes.
And we have seen upsides and downsides to that, watching it as staff seeing these reported. We are seeing a lot of increased meeting attendance with some of these.
You
online
do see
meetings.
increase.
Mhm.
Could we
But-
require both?
Yeah, does it mean that the out-of-town developer doesn't come to town? That's what I wonder about.
Well, usually they have their.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's usually a fee, but we also hear from folks that, that have a harder time connecting with these online meetings, right?
Yeah.
And in certain neighborhoods of the city, we've recommended to people and said, you probably should hold both if you want to have an online meeting. And as staff, we've evaluated that kind of on a basis of, something really hard to codify.
Yeah.
If we're gonna allow online meetings to continue, codifying when it's appropriate, when it's not, is really hard, because it really depends on the neighborhood and the people in the neighborhood, the demographics, the age, the technology friendliness of the people in the neighborhood, which sometimes can be based on age, sometimes not.
So it's currently up to the applicant.
Right.
Which avenue?
Now, if we experience an egregious situation where it looks like, hey, you really didn't take the needs of the neighborhood into consideration when planning this meeting, we have that general code provision that says a location and time designed to be convenient. So we do reserve the right as staff to say you didn't meet those requirements in certain situations.
But are there other minimum requirements, like 5 people after 10? There's nothing. No one could show up. Okay.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Everybody okay with the virtual, in-person discretion?
For now, yeah.
Yes, for now, all right.
As long as we're doing online meetings, it seems like they should be able to, right?
Yeah, that's
If it
Well, we're
changes.
not.
Well, our committee meetings.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
We just had this conversation today at boards and commissions about hybrid, because there's some people who don't have the resources for the internet. It's just,
Yeah.
as long as virtual meetings will always have that call-in option, and folks know that they can call in, that'll help.
How about that motion, Maggie?
Okay, yeah,
All
okay,
right.
so are you gonna just go ahead and make one motion to adopt it with the change? Okay,
And
great.
And then if we, so I make a motion to approve the proposed wording amendment.
Oh, hold on, I'm so sorry, this is a public hearing, we don't need the motion first, we need the public hearing first. Sorry, in our defense, we have started at 2:30 today, so we're a little bleary-eyed at this point, me especially.
2 o'clock.
It was 2 o'clock, I'm sorry, I'm off, all right.
It was yesterday.
All right, we do have a few people signed up to speak under this item. And again, folks, if you weren't here earlier, you have 3 minutes to speak and just watch the lights on the lectern. Red means stop. So the first person signed up to speak is Taryu Ward. And I may not have said that first name correctly, even though you gave me the spelling. But
Thank you for this opportunity to be heard. I live on Pinecroft Road. AMARX is proposing to put 42 townhomes right across the street from where I live. There are a lot of people in the community who have a lot of concerns for a lot of different reasons, and you'll probably hear about some of them. And I would say for the meeting that we had with them, the required meeting, it was 1 hour. Their software was very strange, didn't work. Many people couldn't even raise their hand to speak. Many of us who had been able to raise our hand, when they called upon me and several others, they couldn't unmute. So people who wanted to speak could not raise their hand. People who had been able to raise their hand were not heard. And then I really do not recommend this online meeting, or at least I kind of liked your idea that maybe they could do both. But I feel like the community should be heard, and that we should be able to speak and finish our sentences, because they were able to cut people off and mute them before they were even finished. It was a very perfunctory meeting. It was not satisfying to anybody, I don't think, maybe to them, but not to us as the neighborhood association. So thank you for this.
thank you. Susan Feinblatt?
Good evening, and thank you for letting me speak tonight. So I'm also speaking about I'm in support of these changes to the neighborhood association, but I want to share with you my personal experience with the development that is had our neighborhood meetings recently. It's AMARX Construction. They started when they proposed to increase the density for the development, and the neighborhood meeting was prompted. They first put out incorrect location on their signs and their notices, which prompted the city, thankfully, to ask them to have another meeting. They canceled the meeting. They said it's going to go online. At one point, and it was a registration. We all registered, and it prompted them to send out a cancellation notice. So if it wasn't confusing enough, they then made the registration the day of. Many of us couldn't get on. Those of us that did, and there were 124 plus people that showed up, we were all muted. They took, of the hour that we were given, they took at least half to do their presentation. They asked us to sign up. We asked, when our time came to speak, they didn't unmute us. Only 15 people of the 124 got to speak. And unfortunately, that wasn't satisfactory. Somebody was able to unmute, and they would not extend the meeting. There was no chat feature. We don't really know why this all occurred, but it really speaks to the challenges in addition to a number of elderly in Beaver Dam who could not access the internet. And they were all prepared to go to the in-person meeting and could not go, right? The signs were not put in the neighborhood, so they were on Beaver Dam rather than in the neighborhood. So as a result, people were whizzing by the sign. It was a QR code. They couldn't access it. This is not in the spirit of what the neighborhood meetings are supposed to be like. We have asked the city has been as helpful as they possibly can be, but their hands are tied. There's nothing that they can do. There's no legal reason for them to enforce this, and when you have a developer like the AMARX Construction Company that really does not want to do anything but check the box, that's all they want to do. And they've told that to us. We don't have to do this. The city is not requiring this. it really speaks to how much we need as a city to have some rules that the city can enforce, city staff can enforce.
Thank you.
And I thank you for my time.
Thank you. And just for some context, this is the project that's a level 2, so it's not scheduled to come to us. So,
It makes me wonder if some of the meeting.
I'm sorry, Andrew Fletcher. Got 3 more after this one.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. I'm very encouraged to hear the tenor of your discussion tonight because for me to explain my interest in making this change about going to physical addresses in addition to property owners rather than just property owners, I have to tell you how I learned about this. It was in 2018. It was right after the change was made in the Central Business District. A proposal, this is before the moratorium, so the proposal for a hotel was made. The neighborhood meeting followed the old rules, not the new rules. Only property owners went out, and I happened to discover the paper trail on this, and almost every one of those notices went to a law office in New York City. And there was simply no way, people had no chance to be able to get to these. These are longtime local business owners that have long-term leases. These folks had no chance. The only folks that came to the first meeting that was incorrectly noticed were 8 condo owners that are property owners and residents in those spaces. The second meeting, when properly noticed, 80 people showed up. And there's 50% of the city who would be left out of all the language in the statement of purpose in the ordinance. Because it's all, look at all the words we have: community, neighborhood, residents, surrounding residents. But you can't get those people if you just send a message to my landlord, because that goes to Georgia. It doesn't come to me. And there's huge portions of the city who would be left out of this. And I'm hoping that we get some really great development projects that people can come to these meetings and be supportive of. Maybe I'm an optimist. But we have to give people a chance to improve their neighborhoods, and this is a really, really great way to do that. And it's a very small burden on many places. I'm not sure how you can get a owner's address without getting a mailing address. If you look in the property tax info, they're right next to each other. So I don't really understand what more of a burden is this. I've spent a lot of time in tax info. They're right there next to each other. Apartment buildings are a little different, but hey, it's not that big a deal to have inclusivity for people who don't have the chance to own their own property. We deserve to be at these notification meetings too. So thank you so much for your consideration on this topic. I'm very pleased that it sounds like this is going to be a change that brings more people into these processes. Thank you.
Thank you. Nancy Clark.
Mayor and council members, thanks for the opportunity to speak. Nancy Clark, I live on Beaver Dam Knoll Road. It's within the city of Asheville, and I'm a member of BVNA, Beaver Dam Valley Neighborhood Association, and part of the board of directors. I'm here to voice my support for the proposed changes to the pre-development meeting requirement. The changes that are proposed, extending to the 400 feet notification, that's great. Increasing the number of days for notification, also really good. Templates, terrific. And the best practice guide is going to be helpful to everybody, the developers and the residents. And I'm also really in support of neighborhood associations being involved with this process. We're there to help our residents, our fellow neighbors, and if we're informed, we can help them. So how did BVNA and Beaver Dam neighbors come to feel so passionate about these changes that you're making? I want to reference what Tayria said and also Susan Feinblatt, because we're all talking about the same thing. Last week, the neighborhood was subjected to a really bad, not good, terribly, downright terribly pre-development neighborhood meeting for that parcel in question behind the Accordius nursing home. This parcel has grandfathered RM16 zoning, and it's surrounded by much lower density zoning in all of that area of Beaver Dam. If the missteps in this meeting weren't so terrible, it would almost be comedic. And as soon as Susan said, the original meeting had to be canceled because the address was wrong. They decided to have the virtual meeting. 124 people showed up for that. The meeting was too short. People weren't able to speak. If they got called on, they couldn't unmute. It almost looked like we were hapless people, when in fact it was in the hands of the meeting organizer who got able to speak. People asked for the meeting to be continued given all these technological problems. The developer declined. The changes to the UDO don't address some of the problems that the Beaver Dam residents experienced. For example, if more people are notified, it would seem that the meeting should go longer so more people would have a chance to speak. Also, a platform should be chosen that isn't great for the developer, but bad for the neighborhood. Microsoft Teams, that's used in a lot of corporations. A lot of people have no experience with that platform whatsoever. It doesn't feel like we know what to do compared to Zoom or even Google Meets. So these are a couple of changes that I think really should be included, but I do support what has been proposed. Thank you.
Thank you. Paula Coughlin.
Hi, thank you all for hearing me, and I want to wholeheartedly thank Honorable Mayor and City Council for inviting some public input on this issue. I serve on the Charlotte Street Neighborhood Association Board, and I have read the Living Asheville plan, and I really applaud the efforts that seem to be included in that to fold in the residents of Asheville. I mean, I think it is implied that you want to hear from the people who live here. And I came from a situation working with the city on another development, and we've had so many glitches in how we were trying to communicate with the builder or the developer, much like the Beaver Dam community. So I wholeheartedly endorse this first step in enhancing communication between business, development, and community. And I want to say that the part that's so important to me is the residents, not the owners. The owners often are listed as an estate, or they are listed as a trust, or they're listed by somebody out of state, and they have no compunction to share with the residents this information that might be changing their lives. We saw so many residents in the Charlotte Street neighborhood be displaced, and they were completely caught off guard by it because they were renting. So I really applaud that we want the opportunity to have residents involved, as well as homeowners or property owners. But more importantly, these residents, longtime or new people that actually live there and are going to be impacted, may be your best resource for resolving conflicts between what is proposed and what could actually happen. And to cut those people out of the equation is what I experienced. And it was more than frustrating. It was dishonorable to my neighbors who have lived in my neighborhood for so long and are problem solvers and want to help you, all of you, create a living Asheville. So I encourage any step you take that involves the residents and the owners, but most importantly, the people who live there. And 400 feet is nothing. You can click on that GIS, I've done it, and boom, I got an email, I got a list of residents or addresses, and I made it clear. We did mailers, and I'm not an IT person. It's so simple. I cannot imagine a contractor or a developer having a problem being able to reach their residents.
Thank you.
But thank you for your efforts, and I'm here to help. Thanks.
Patrick Gilbert.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, Madam City Council members, Madam City Manager, Mr. Branham, city staff. My name is Patrick Gilbert.
And Maggie.
Maggie, she's city staff. Maggie, she's been a great help. I'm Patrick Gilbert. I'm the Vice President for Government Relations for the Coalition of Asheville Neighborhoods, also known as by the acronym CAN. I'm here tonight to urge you to approve these Unified Development Ordinance text amendments pertaining to the UDO required neighborhood development meetings, which is part of the development pre-application process. These amendments mark the culmination of nearly 3 years of discussions between CAN and city staff in this phase of trying to find improvements to the neighborhood meeting process. Back in 2020, after several major neighborhood meetings that went long and receiving complaints from neighborhood associations and residents about the inconsistency with which neighborhood meetings were conducted and then ultimately reported to the city, I asked for a meeting with Ben Woody, who was then the Director of Development Services, and Chris Collins, who is the Planning and Development Manager. In that meeting, I went over some of these incidents and complaints that we received, and I offered that there just has to be a better way to conduct these neighborhood meetings. They agreed, and so set us off on this 3-year venture. Together with the neighborhood meeting guide for developers and residents, which was part of the discussions we had with city staff, these text amendments will add much needed consistency, transparency, clarity, access, as well as enhanced neighborhood association and resident input into these neighborhood meetings. I want to acknowledge both the CAN Board of Directors, who represent 20 city neighborhoods, the Legacy Neighborhood Coalition, the Customer Development Advisory Group, and the Planning and Zoning Commissions for supporting these amendments. I also want to thank the members of the CAN Government Relations Committee, Mr. Woody, Mr. Collins, and city staff, both current and former, in development services and planning and urban design for their diligent work on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that concludes the number of people that have signed up to speak. Thank you all for coming tonight to talk about this issue, and thank you for your involvement in crafting it.
I do have a question.
Yep, no, go ahead.
Before I have a motion. So I'm hearing a lot of support for these changes to meet neighborhood concerns around community engagement. When asked at our agenda briefing on Thursday if there were any outstanding lingering concerns, I didn't hear this one until after our meeting. But there was a second one that popped up, which is a request that if a development or project changes by a certain percent, that it would trigger a follow-up meeting. And I haven't heard that at all, but I did hear from folks that they were promised it would come to us later. So
I'm sorry, say that again.
are we expecting to amend this twice this year?
No, are you talking about the size or the number in attendance? The size of the project versus the number in attendance?
The way that I understand it is, number one, add physical addresses so that the folks in proximity get an alert. The second one is, if a project changes by a certain percentage, that's the
triggers another.
It triggers a follow-up meeting.
Well, there's definitions for that, right? A substantial
Well,
change.
maybe you want to address that, how that works.
Sure.
I wish we had known these on Thursday.
That's, you hear me say hard to codify with some of these things a lot, but we do with any substantial change on a development right now, if they come back to amend that, as you can see with what we've heard about this Pinecroft development, which was a previously applied for development that increased the number of units, we do currently require another neighborhood meeting to be held on that amended application.
But it's just substantial, it's not a defined percentage.
It's not a defined percentage right now. We had a hard time settling on a defined percentage in order to codify it and all the different elements that can change.
It's yet another term for staff to interpret as they
Yeah.
go along enforcing the UDO.
Right.
Okay.
City staff don't really, we'd rather have solid guideposts for this, but sometimes they're hard to establish.
Chris, while we have you at the podium, are you done?
Well, I mean, so just resolution
it
on
would have
that.
been, it would have been good, I think, on Thursday to know that there are still some lingering questions and that might come back to us so that we would.
So, I mean, two things. One, I mean, the project that they're talking about actually changed so substantially. It's like, it's a new, is it an amendment or an application that triggered a level 2 review so that it needed a public, a neighborhood meeting?
It triggered the level 2 previously as well, so it is an amendment to that.
But because of the nature, was this one where staff had to decide whether or not a neighborhood meeting was required, or did it automatically trigger it?
It's pretty, well, we had to make the determination, but it's pretty clear in this instance.
Because the other thing you might be, I wasn't sure if you were talking about, is where an applicant puts in the application and the project sort of evolves during that application process and can change substantially. I mean, we've seen it happen where we've approved a project and it was commercial and residential, and then later they carved out the commercial. Well, now they gotta get us to come back to us, but is that enough to trigger another neighborhood meeting? You know, so I don't know.
Well, I guess the question I would have, so I could better inform myself and others that would ask me, is have members of the public or who have engaged around this update been told that that will be coming up again soon?
Our discussion has been that was, well, okay, let me try and encapsulate 3 years of discussion into a concise answer. But we said if we can determine codifiable factors around change to development, that would come at a later date because the groups we were working with wanted to see the rest of this move forward.
So we don't have a direct timeline, just an indefinite if we get to be able to.
We have an option though, because we're talking about simplicity upgrades. What if this new form for these neighborhood meetings that staff will now get back, and it will have an attendance, I assume, in those emails and stuff, what if we just said, do you want to be added to Simply City? And then they get the notifications for all of the other review opportunities. Do you know what I mean? So it wouldn't be the
so it
only
would not
time
be
that they
a-
heard it, and they would be informed of the future meetings. It's an option.
It's a good idea.
It's an option, but it would be more someone's entering all that. Maybe the developer should. The other question I have you here, this meeting sounds horrible, the one that folks were talking about, and that is alarming, and it certainly isn't the goal. And I'm wondering if we're gonna allow these virtual meetings, if we need some kind of control body in the room, in the virtual room, or somebody that's like, hey, this was a disaster, somebody that isn't the developer, you know what I mean? We don't send city staff to neighborhood meetings, but I wonder if there's some trigger there while we're still doing some virtual.
Sure, so traditionally, as you said, since this started in
Yeah.
2018, we haven't sent city staff for reasons of resource, but also reasons of wanting to further that dialogue directly between the proposed developer and the neighbors. In my multiple years of experience, I found city staff being present can often be kind of a crutch to that communication. But that said, something we could explore. It's very cyclical as far as being able to resource staff to attend all the meetings. Sometimes we have 6 in a week, and sometimes we don't have one for 6. Well, you never don't have one for 6 weeks, but sometimes we go well. It is something that we could explore more.
I just wonder if a few of them are still doing virtual, and if it's not as big a lift, because a lot of them do happen in person. I don't know. It's just an idea, I don't just
From
suggest.
what I've seen lately, they're mostly still being held virtually. That's of the that's of the developers who are registering the meetings. As I said earlier, we're requesting that they register right now.
Gotcha.
So we don't know about all of them that are going on out there, but.
You mentioned earlier, if staff hears, you know, because I worry a little bit about making a change to an ordinance based on one situation we're hearing about that's gone terribly wrong when the 90% of them were not, it's going smoothly. So you mentioned earlier that there's a way for staff to kind of determine that the neighborhood meeting did not meet the intent of the requirements and that they need a do-over. Are you able to, do you feel that that is enough for you, for example, in this situation to say, look, you can't have an hour-long meeting where people are muted with that many people in attendance and call it, done, you had the neighborhood meeting?
So staff, myself and other staff, we've been following this neighborhood meeting in Beaver Dam proposed development as it unfolds. And we have stepped in once and just recommended, hey, you noticed the meeting wrong with the wrong address, you probably should redo that, because we're not going to accept that when you try and submit your application. And it's hard to say till I receive all their materials. I can say that a lot of mistakes have been made in this process. There have been a lot of confused people.
So do you feel that you have the discretion under the current wording of the ordinance to say that that meeting was unsatisfactory, or do we need to actually?
I think under the current wording, which we would have to apply to the meeting they've already held,
It would, right.
the most concrete thing that we have is a time and place designed to be convenient. So there's nothing said as to the content of the meeting or how the meeting flows or anything like that.
And the length of the meeting?
Right, outside of like, hey, did you notify the right people? Did you give enough time? We have to isolate the time and place, or the location and time designed to be convenient, I believe is the wording, but that's a good paraphrase if not, yeah.
Interesting. Well, maybe just a suggestion for the future as we navigate this. Maybe we won't be virtual much longer. Who knows?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I do want to make sure I say thank you to the people who put in 3 years of volunteer time on this. My goodness.
That's great.
That's lengthy. And to the staff who had to do the same 3 years.
All right.
Yeah, do it.
I make,
Just quickly, Mayor, could you officially close the public hearing on this?
there you go.
The public hearing is closed. So I think we talked about the notification requirement to property owners and residents.
I think that's the only change at this time.
Right. Okay. Go ahead now, Maggie, and make a motion.
I make a motion to approve the proposed wording amendments to Chapter 7 of the Asheville Code of Ordinances and find that the proposed amendments are reasonable, are in the public interest, are consistent with the city's comprehensive plan, and meet the development needs of the community, in that the amendment will, 1, help promote equity within the pre-application process of land development, 2, increase opportunities for constructive dialogue between residents and land developers, and 3, create a clear and well-documented process pending the adjustment to the language that says the mailed notice shall be sent to all residents and property owners throughout the ordinance revisions.
Second. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any other questions, comments? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. Thank you. All right, so that concludes our public hearings agenda. Are we barreling on, or do you need a quick break, or everybody good? Barreling? Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, we'll let everyone sort of exit. Change up, we are, just give a second here.
Yeah, hey, send us Ken's candy down there. Hey, Maggie. Maggie.
It's just the budget.
I know, but no one's gonna have a comment about it because they're.
If I eat that, I will.
I cannot stay awake, so I need some of that.
Okay, we're gonna go on to our unfinished business. This is the ordinance adopting the fiscal year 2024 annual operating budget. And just to recap, I'm sure, I know you're gonna recap, but just so everybody knows tonight, not that there's too many people left, but we don't take public comment on the budget tonight because we already took public comment on the budget actually twice this year, as well as hearing several presentations and having several work sessions on the budget. So we are going to hand it over to Tony McDowell we're going to hand it over to Deborah, who's going to hand it to Tony. Deborah, please.
Well, they're trusting me with the entire presentation tonight, so you will only see about 3 slides since it's on me. So I'm going to go. Good evening again, and hopefully tonight will be the final step in the budget process that started for staff in September with internal discussions, with council in December of 2022 with the discussion of the capital budget. January through May, we provided numerous and early opportunities for public comment that included an online survey and 2 public comment sessions starting in February, the first one, and the required public hearing being held last month. Also, since December, council has had 4 budget work sessions. So as a result, I believe I can say we have had a pretty thorough budget process, and hopefully you're ready to adopt the manager's proposed fiscal year 2023-2024 budget. I want to again thank our incredibly hardworking staff. As you know, the budget process takes a village with input provided by staff in all of our city departments. But I want to especially acknowledge and thank staff in our finance and management department. Finance Director Tony McDowell and staff in the budget division led by Taylor Floyd, and our budget analysts who aren't here tonight, Heather Curry, Abigail Rowley, and Liz Green for their patience and help throughout this process. I want to again thank you, Mayor and Council, for your service to this great city and for your time, for the input and guidance you've provided throughout this process. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank the community members who provided their input as it relates to this proposed budget. Now, in summary, the proposed budget totals approximately $240 million, does not recommend a change in the property tax rate, and includes a compensation adjustment, 5% salary increase for existing employees at 6% for sworn police officers. It continues funding core community services consistent and in alignment with council's priorities, and it strategically utilizes fund balance. Next slide, please. And as we discussed at your agenda briefing, staff would like to add 1 additional item to the proposed budget that wasn't presented last month. And this is an incentive pay of 5% for Asheville Fire Department for the North Carolina Advanced Firefighter Certification. And the rationale is that this was a request from AFD, but wasn't recommended in the initial proposed budget. However, a similar request was also made and recommended for the Asheville Police Department. The addition of this incentive pay will hopefully strengthen our competitive edge in terms of recruiting and retaining public safety employees. The incentive pay encourages employees to further educate themselves, which will result in a more skilled and highly trained workforce for the city of Asheville. The estimated cost for this change would be approximately $250,000. As you can see, the funding source would be from the fund balance appropriation, which would leave approximately 16% available, which would be still above your 15% policy. I also want to recommend, as we go into our next budget cycle, that we believe this type of incentive pay is beneficial, not only for public safety employees, but also for trades and labor positions. So in the next budget, we will be aggressively pursuing these types of opportunities outside of the public safety pay plans. I hope that the city manager's office sent a clear message to our existing and potential employees that they have a career with us, not just a job. Part of that process is what we are calling a career ladder plan, which provides a clear path and opportunities for mobility for our employees. As your training and skills are upgraded, your pay will be upgraded as well. I strongly believe that the best recruitment strategy is a good retention strategy. We think this is a good retention and recruitment strategy both for Asheville Fire Department, Asheville Police Department, but also those in labor and trade positions. Mayor, this concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Well, we've had lots of meetings on this, and as I've said before, we want to thank Deborah, you and your team, and Tony and your team, all of you all that have put so much time and work and energy into this. We have developed a pretty robust budgeting process, and involved in that is getting a lot of community input around the budget. So with surveys and the many, many meetings. So I think this is the reason we don't have too many people here tonight, is probably because this has been worked on for so long and a lot of adjustments have been made to it to try to make it the best document it can be for this next fiscal year. And there's always more needs in our community and more we wish we could do, but we're trying to maximize what we do have without creating a greater burden on the community from a financial standpoint to be able to get there. Any other questions, comments?
I have a question. And it just came as I was like watching. In the past, we've had a pretty good awareness of like how much extra we landed with and where we started. For example, what would have been the total amount of the fund balance if we hadn't done all the extra one-time things? Do we have a picture of that? Is it 2 million? Is it? It's loose. I think that's a part of a picture for future budgets that might be helpful as folks see us as we negotiate the budget and we get more sales tax revenue in. It's like it's messaged right now as like a trickling out, and I think we could probably communicate that differently. Sure. I also have a statement. Budgets are moral documents that fund our public services and represent our community values through allocation of our public tax dollars. This is my 8th budget cycle. 5 years of those were in the audience, where I often didn't hear the reasons behind budget votes. Tonight is both a privilege and responsibility to make a statement on my budget position, starting with gratitude, thanks to neighbors who engaged with the process, including surveys, public hearings, the additional public comment period provided by staff. Thanks to our Urban Forestry Commission and advocates for recommending partnership to fund and implement a forestry master plan to repair a tree canopy. Thanks to those pushing us to send the right responder with the right tools and training as we partner and work to expand emergency and proactive responses during public safety crisis. And thanks to living wage advocates. This budget includes transit study funding to explore collaboration between the city and the county for coordination and expansion, an urban forestry master plan, and reparations funding that I understand reflects the Community Reparations Committee recommendation with the inclusion of compounding interest thanks to retreat input and recommendation by my colleague Councilwoman Mosley. The budget also includes shift and training incentives for public works and public safety staff. The budget does not include the full 2010 living wage compliance based on the cost of housing to recruit and retain staff with the quality, equitable services our community deserves. And there's more funding needed for our stated climate crisis and for strategic partnership funds for youth programming. I also acknowledge there's serious work ahead to meet obligations and address gaps in our public safety response. I'm thankful for the conversation about our strategic priorities in the work session we had before this meeting that is archived on the city's website. As our community recovers from overlapping crises, my #1 objective is supporting partnership to improve public safety and well-being. This looks like addressing root causes of violence by expanding our public safety response so behavioral health specialists are deployed to behavioral health crises, partnering for violence interruption programming, moving our community responder pilot to a fully realized program, as well as addressing root causes of crime by investing in community. I think a great first step doesn't require imagining or reimagining, it requires acting on bolstering partnership with the county's community paramedicine program to address deep needs addressing substance use poisoning and mental and behavioral health, since health and human services are roles and responsibilities of the county. And if we limit investment in a strong, reliable public safety system moving forward by focusing solely on attempting to go back to business as usual, then we will miss an opportunity to shift to data-driven options that are available when the community needs us to pivot to meet this moment. I promise I'm almost done. How we fund the budget matters. A significant amount of fund balance is being used, as well as some ARPA and COVID relief funds, which means identifying funding for future budgets will be a challenge. Lastly, we're having hard conversations in City Hall because our community is having really hard conversations. So I'm going to support the seeds that are in this budget, including transit, urban forestry to address climate crisis and neighborhood resiliency, a growing reparations fund, the community responder pilot program. I'm committed to the work to ensure quality, equitable service outcomes with this council of caring, capable colleagues. And I'm encouraged in this work because our neighbors care and demand better. I know it's not perfect, and I know I'm going to hear about it later, but stay in the work with us.
What is that, a yes for the budget? Is that what I'm hearing?
It is.
Oh, wow.
Really? Okay.
We have a lot of work to do ensuring quality, equitable service outcomes.
She's never moved.
I'm not okay with us just using a bunch of savings and not having a plan for next year, and we've got to get the living wages. So I'll celebrate when we doing some more work.
Why don't you make that motion?
I would like to take that a little further for you, and I appreciate what you have said this evening. I'm wondering, just as the city manager was able to propose the additional certification pay for firefighters, would it make you feel even more comfortable if, given your yes on this vote, we also take the opportunity to somewhat direct the city manager to look into everything you just suggested, so that perhaps we could even amend the budget later in the year?
Yes.
Okay.
Are you gonna make the motion, Kim?
I'm not ready to make a motion. I did a lot of talking.
Okay, baby steps here.
Too far,
Come on,
okay.
baby steps. All right.
I appreciated all the shock in those staff faces.
I'll start with the first one. Do we need to do so we can split it?
Because we
everyone else
got,
have a lot to talk
Brad,
about?
you do guide us through this with the conflict issue.
So the original budget motion, and Tony, you're gonna correct me if I say this different than you laid out. The original budget motion doesn't have any conflicts in it. When I'm talking about conflicts, we're dealing with North Carolina General Statute 14-234.3, which requires any council member who is associated with a nonprofit who's receiving appropriations through a budget or otherwise to recuse himself from that vote. This particular budget does not allocate any funds, as far as we have gained from talking to you, to any of those specific nonprofit entities. Now, immediately after that, we'll have a couple of additional appropriations that are just going to be budget amendments that will deal specifically with two nonprofits, the Sports Commission and the Economic Development Commission, where we have conflicts. Now, before each one of those, we'll have to do a recusal for who it applies to. So, if there are additional nonprofits that we haven't taken into account, now is our last opportunity.
The Asheville Downtown Association. We missed it last year and decided it was too late after the fact, but we should add it to recuse myself. Yeah, because we also changed, rent and things. And events and
they're trying to
downtown
decide.
after 5 and July 4th and the holiday parade.
So, all right, so Tony, I take it the
Fireworks.
base budget right now has an appropriation to the Downtown Association?
No, it's,
I think there is as part of the July.
it's July 4th and all the holidays.
Well,
That's
and the in-kind,
You're a voting member.
We missed it last year, sorry.
Okay, so my recommendation, because I think this would require some substantial changes perhaps at the very last minute of some budgeting. Sage, what we could do is a path of least resistance is you could recuse yourself from this particular budget vote. We only need 4 members of council to approve the budget, so you could recuse yourself from the first.
You almost had
That's not the plan.
7.
You're
You were
just
so
saying.
close to 7.
I understand, but I'll have to defer to Tony about whether or not, because
Because we can't make a separate motion just for me and Asheville
Well,
Downtown.
I think the challenge is that sitting here tonight, we don't know the amount of
Oh,
the
you have to know the
ADA
amount.
appropriation, so we would have to know the exact amount to do the budget amendment. So I think Mr. Branham's suggestion is probably the best path forward here.
Okay, well then I'm gonna run to the bathroom.
Could she make the motion and not vote on it?
do what?
Could she make the motion and not vote on it?
Not supposed to deliberate.
Yeah, she's not technically supposed to deliberate it on either. So what I would recommend is maybe we entertain an initial motion right now to recuse Councilmember Turner.
all right, do I have a
from the
motion to
first vote.
recuse Councilwoman Turner?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, now you can run, and can somebody else do the motion?
I make a motion to adopt an ordinance adopting the fiscal year 2023-2024 annual budget.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we passed the budget. Yay.
So now I go on. I make a motion to recuse Mayor Mannheimer from voting on the attached budget amendment in accordance with the North Carolina Session Law 2021-191 SB 473 Economic Development Coalition.
Oh, right.
Sandra, I'll second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay.
I'm just gonna keep it rolling. I make a motion to adopt the fiscal year.
Well, you don't have to actually leave. She just had to go to the restroom. I do too, by the way, but
We're so close. Motion to adopt the fiscal year 2023-2024 budget amendment in the amount of $100,000 in the general fund to allocate budget from the city manager's contingency to fund the city's annual contribution to nonprofits with which members of council are associated, Economic Development Coalition.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
I make a motion to recuse Councilwoman Turner from voting on the attached budget amendment in accordance with North Carolina Session Law 2021-191 SB.
You're-
I don't think.
We don't have to do it again.
Because she's already.
We got
She's already
her.
used.
But
Oh, okay, so we just, yep, got it. Okay, so then, since she's not here, we make a motion to adopt the fiscal year 2023-24 budget amendment in the amount of $45,000 in the general fund to allocate budget from city manager's contingency to fund the city's annual contribution to nonprofits with which members of council are associated, Sports Commission.
Sandra, I'll second.
all right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Or what happened? Are we?
We all
We're good.
said aye.
Gotta love that state law that we.
We did it.
Yeah. Okay, great. It's sort of anticlimactic, but.
In
That's
spirit,
all.
you had all 7.
In spirit.
I voted in the hall.
Okay, I'm turning it over to the vice mayor to bring us home here.
Yes.
Thank you,
Okay.
guys. Good night. See you.
Okay, the Boards and Commission Committee met earlier this morning. We reviewed 29 possible appointments. 5 were due to resignations and 6 were eligible for reappointment, but were not interested. The first board, African American Heritage Commission, the Boards and Commissions Committee recommends the appointment of Shalinda Pruitt. Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Airport Authority, the Board and Commissions Committee recommends the reappointment of Susan Russo Klein. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Civic Center Commission, the Boards and Commission Committee recommends the reappointment of John Ellis and Chad Evans. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Historic Resources Commission, the Boards and Commissions Committee recommends the reappointment of Will Hornaday and the appointment of Claire Thomas. Can I get a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Human Relations Commissions, the Board and Commissions Committee recommends the appointment of Candace Blankard and Susan Ann Sacco. In addition, the clerk's office will re-advertise for the council committee to revisit the other 4 openings at the October 10th meeting. The 4 current members up for reappointment will be advised that they are to continue serving until they are reappointed or replaced. Can I get a second on this motion?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The Multimodal Transportation Commission. The Board and Commissions Committee recommends the reappointment of Jack Elgman and the appointment of Joseph Barker and Mike Zukowski. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
The Neighborhood Advisory Committee. The Boards and Commissions Committee recommends the appointment of Sandra Freepong to represent 28805
Joe Taylor to represent 28804, Dane Barringer to the seat at large. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, the Public Arts and Cultural Commission, the Board and Commissions Committee recommends the reappointment of Shirley Whiteside and Pat Capus and Pete Perez. Clerk's office will re-advertise for the remaining seats. And can I get a second?
How about, do you need a motion? How about,
Can I get a motion? Can I get a second?
I can't do both.
Oh,
but
okay.
You can.
A motion and second?
This is
I don't
just.
even think
Yeah.
we really need a second.
Yeah, so just aye. Yeah, this is, yeah. Can
I
get
was
a mo-
making the motion.
I'll make a motion,
Second.
okay.
Sorry.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Sustainability, the Advisory Committee, Clerk's Office will re-advertise. And the Buncombe County Tourism Development Authority, the Boards and Commission Committee recommends the appointment of Lucius Wilson. Is there a second?
Second.
All in
Before we
fa-
do that, can I have a comment?
Sure.
We talked about this in boards and commissions. I think we have some really great candidates. And I also always prefer that we interview for our state required or quasi-judicial boards. However, I'm excited to support this move tonight.
So all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Are you okay?
All right.
The Planning and Zoning Commission, the Board and Commissions Committee recommends continuing to advertise through the July advertising cycle and interview all current and new applicants at the August 22nd Boards and Commission meeting before Council's consideration of appointments at the August 22nd Council meeting. Can I get a second?
Second.
Oh, sorry.
You can have it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. In other boards and commissions and council committee business, the July 11th, 2023 Boards and Commission Council Committee meeting will be canceled, and the August 8th meeting will be rescheduled to August 22nd at 1 p.m. And this concludes the Boards and Commissions Committee business, and I'll turn it back over to the mayor.
Okay, and I'm actually gonna have you help do this part, because I really gotta run to the restroom. All right, folks, we've reached the part of our meeting where we have general public comment. Again, you'll have 3 minutes to provide your comment. Just watch the lights on the lectern. I'm gonna run out for just a quick second. The first person signed up to speak is Stephanie Phillips.
Tonight, personally thank the mayor, the council, the county commissioners, their president, guest speakers, the city employees, volunteers and the citizens for the Memorial Day service. I'd like to thank and honor all military members and families, past and present, from every country worldwide for their service and sacrifice. No actuary could calculate how many lives total have been lost in combat, not just war. Our current seniors, elder statesmen are asking the age-old question, is this generation better off than the one before? New perspective, children, middle age, and elders. We believe if we act now, it will be. The collective bargaining power of our seniors, many former civil servants, are rising to the challenge of not just securing the viability of their communities, but the entire planet. I recently went back to the town hall of Kensington, Maryland, and thanked the administration department, telling them this was a great place to live and grow up. We all have our challenges. The difference was we knew and helped our neighbors. Our civil servants were living amongst us, proactively serving, protecting, teaching, and rescuing. We had affordable, free recreation, parks, and entertainment. It's time to end the Civil War, all war, and sign a lasting, sustainable peace treaty so that all countries, one neighborhood at a time, can rebuild themselves and then help neighboring countries with supplies and human resources wherever possible. I've been advocating for peace now for almost 2 decades. I would like to help more. Please authenticate my grandmother's will, stamped Buncombe County, year 70, film to item 346. My father's identity through an enlistment records of the war here, and my birth record identity. I will be available for a closed door session to discuss this. The measure of success of humanity is when all children can compare and contrast the world upon reaching adulthood and still be able to afford and choose to live and serve where they were raised. Peace be with you. My name is Stephanie Phillips. I believe and have been told my probable birth given name is Carolyn Ann Phillips. I'm the daughter of Luther Phillips, who is birthday October 26, year 1921 or 1922. His records were destroyed in a flood in Madison County. He was a proud World War II Marine Corps veteran. I know this is a little late here. This is my first opportunity to be here. My father taught me to appreciate all veterans.
Thank you
one
very
at a
much.
time. Thank you.
Next up will be Nina Tovich.
Given how long y'all have been discussing today, I don't think you need to hear from me this afternoon.
Thank you, Nina. We're glad you're here.
Next up will be Jonathan Wainscott.
My name is Jonathan Wainscott. I just wanted to add to the timeline on the water issue. At 8:43 on December 31st, New Year's Eve, I wrote to the mayor, and the subject line, Happy New Year. And the email reads, thank you for enduring all that you get from the public and of course from yours truly. I don't blame you for the water situation, by the way. Happy New Year, and about an hour later, because we're both lame on New Year's Eve, you responded, thanks, Jonathan, I appreciate it, Happy New Year to you. But at the time, I was thinking, well, because the mayor is getting a lot of heat for this, but you don't have anything to do with operational stuff, and the public shouldn't be blaming you for this. But it turns out that you were in operational meetings, and as the report showed earlier, which is incredibly disturbing, is that you exerted, I believe it was job-threatening pressure on the staff that was trying to deal with this situation. And that is very close. I mean, you're a lawyer, I'm sure you would say it's very far. But I think that that's very close to a direct order by an elected official of staff, and that violates our charter, and that is a misdemeanor. Telling everybody that the water was going to be on in 24 to 48 hours, that's what everybody's mad about. No one's remembering about the hardships of not having water. It's the information conduit, not the water pipes, that people are necessarily worried about, though they should be more worried about it. We have a dilapidated water structure, which makes me wonder, what in the hell is the Department of Sustainability doing? How did this go over everybody's head? You know? We have an understaffed water department, and we have a fully staffed Department of Sustainability that I guess is spending its time trying to figure out what we're going to do when the icebergs melt or something. I don't really know what you do, but the sustainability of our water situation should be absolutely on the radar of that. I give props to the manager, who was found to be not at all at fault, did everything right in this job, and is taking responsibility for keeping her boss essentially out of the room. I think that's very generous of you, but I mean, you guys hold the contract for her renewal in your hand, and so when the mayor wants to be in the meeting, I don't see how you can exactly say no. So I don't fault you for doing a poor job on this. I think you did everything that you were supposed to, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know where this goes. From here, citizen's arrest, I guess. Is that possible? I don't know how the misdemeanor thing works out, but you're talking about how can we get better information out there? The report said use the news media.
Thank you.
Anyway, have a good night.
Mike Raines.
Yes.
Hello. My name is Mike Raines. I'm a retired professional engineer and live with my wife in Asheville. To be honest, I'm here with a mix of both sad and angry feelings. I'm here tonight to ensure that you on City Council are made aware of the full truth behind the recent past water event, which is that this extreme water outage was caused solely by the water department itself. Freezing weather was only an initiating factor. We know that Mills River had to be shut down because critical equipment froze. That event was totally preventable if basic maintenance and testing programs had been in place like what existed at the Hendersonville plant just next door. What most don't know is that the massive leakage that began on Saturday, the 24th, was also directly caused by the water department. Mills River was taken offline at around 8 a.m., and the southern portion was placed back on the main system. This critical system alignment was done improperly, causing a significant hydraulic transient, known to you as water hammer, that broke open numerous pipes. The disturbing lack of transparency around this event is a continuation of an ongoing pattern and is of great concern to me. Because lack of basic honesty and transparency by the top leadership of this department has the potential for dangerous influence down through the organization. And if you don't realize, I will make clear that this is an almost totally self-regulated public health and safety function. There is very little direct oversight by DENQ. Every worker's professional integrity and honesty is critical to ensure safe and reliable drinking water to the public. The most pressing improvements do not involve any piping replacement or other capital expenditures, although engineers typically migrate first in that direction. I can attest to that. The needed improvements are primarily organizational, programmatic, and human performance related in nature. Things like formalized training, written operating guidelines or procedures, error-free configuration control, valve positions, and organizational changes for better communication and coordination. All of these well-established approaches and tools are out there for the taking. We urgently need additional operating funding, key staff augmentation, and frankly, a serious change of culture to implement these in a timely manner.
Thank you. Council, that concludes our public comment. Anything else? We are adjourned.